the first ruler of the empire, Belvitz, Alexander the Great, the greatest genius to this day, was considered a blessing for the empire. He was able to hear the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the shining sun that never sets soul. Great night of the moon, protecting the light of the moon. They were everywhere and watched everyone the star stela. Their mystical abilities and irresistible appearance were the symbol of the empire. The priest looked closely at the little girl and asked her to pray more diligently. The lady was puzzled, for she had prayed very hard, but all in vain. The priest asked the second princess if she could already hear the voice of the star. The princess was puzzled because unfortunately she heard nothing. She glanced sideways at her family because she was terrified. She saw her father's gaze, which was burning with anger, and froze in place. A moment later she said in a trembling voice that unfortunately she couldn't hear yet. Her father was furious. He shouted that she had also failed today, and for this reason she should give up. He looked at his daughter with fury and called the knight. In turn, the knight silently pulled his sword from its sheath. The priest was in shock and shouted at the knight to stop. The emperor sighed heavily and leaving said that they were finished for today. Unlike other members of the imperial family, the young lady unfortunately did not possess such strength. Sometime later she was sleeping in the cold room. In her sleep she heard someone scream, and a moment later she opened her eyes. She walked slowly to the door because she was scared. She wanted to see what was behind the door. When the young lady opened the door, she froze in place in shock. The young lady was very scared because she saw how the knights swept away everyone in their path. The knight angrily ordered his subordinates to grab the balls because they had to deal with the emperor. The young lady decided to leave the palace in a hurry, but she froze when she saw the knight dealing with the man. She was puzzled because she understood that what her father had so feared had happened. She was horrified by what she had just seen because she understood that people had razed his building. But a moment later she heard her mother's voice. With lightning speed, she went into the room. Opening the door, she saw the entire imperial family. She looked at her family with fear and asked where they were going. The empress told Stella with a grin that they all needed her help. The empress asked Stella to stop the knights from pursuing them as they left. Stella was in shock, but suddenly she looked back as she heard the knights scream. The emperor looked at the girl with his rage and contempt and said that now for the first time she would be useful. She froze in shock when she saw her family simply leaving while she remained in place. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to her father. As he closed the door, he looked at his daughter with contempt and said that it would be a noble sacrifice on her part. The lady was in shock. She screamed to her father, but it was all in vain. She desperately clung to the opportunity to leave with them, but unfortunately, they left her. The young lady was in shock, standing by the closet. She cried quietly. A moment later, the knights entered the room as they had one last room to check. The commander was furious because he realized that the imperial family had fled. The man slowly approached the girl, who was sitting on the ground and quietly crying. He looked at her intently and put his sword to her throat. The trembling lady begged for salvation. The commander shouted to his subordinate that they had no time to worry about the maid, since they had to look for the emperor. With a flash of lightning, the knights left the room because they found no one. The young lady was shocked by everything that was happening. She slowly turned her head and saw the body of the maid. She froze in place because she understood that she was left alone in this world. The young lady woke up and was breathing heavily because she had had a terrible nightmare. She was puzzled because she couldn't breathe normally. The lady sighed heavily when suddenly she was asked outside the door if she was awake. A moment later, Ethel informed her aunt that she was all packed and ready. The royal girl, who was separated from the maid, miraculously survived. Stella Idolante, now called Ethel. On a beautiful evening, the adventurers' haven was filled with noise and hubbub. The young lady slowly walked downstairs and saw that her little sister had already met her. With the speed of lightning, the girl rushed at her sister with a smile on her face. Daisy looked at her sister with a smile and showed her the small announcement. She smiled and said that her sister looked very much like the youngest princess. The young lady slowly took the advertisement and looked closely at the drawing. She read the advertisement and was momentarily taken aback as the unfortunate princess was currently being sought. She was shocked by this news as she understood that it was she who was being sought. Daisy said with a smile that the younger princess's similar parents really loved her because they were looking for her. Daisy said with a happy smile that this time they even attached a portrait, but it seemed like they were afraid to show her face before because of her beauty. Daisy happily said that similar parents were worried that the princess might be kidnapped by bad people, so they hid her in the palace and didn't tell anyone about it. The young lady in turn looked at her sister with a smile, but she understood perfectly well that everything was quite the opposite. She knew that this announcement was completely different from the harsh reality. The emperor once shouted at her in rage that she was just a decoy because they had to protect the real princess. The empress shouted at her that she was just a fake and that the real princess had great power, and they overcame her elsewhere. The young lady was scared. She knew that even if she was ugly, she still wanted to be their daughter. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew she had to stop thinking about this already. She understood perfectly well that she would never reveal her true identity because of someone's words. Daisy said with a happy smile that she was very worried about the princess, and everyone in the empire would like to know as much as possible about her. The man looked at them with a smile and said that if they found the princess, their lives would change dramatically. While drinking alcohol, they said that the finder would be given a title and lands as well as gold. Looking at the lady, they said that most likely the princess was already dead. Daisy screamed with fury that this was impossible, and she was definitely alive. The men did not exchange glances because they did not understand why it had not yet declared itself. They said that in that case, she could easily return to the palace and live like a princess. Daisy was puzzled and did not know what to answer. The young lady looked closely at her little sister. As she saw that she was very upset, she ran towards the men with lightning speed. Ethel quickly took the alcohol from them and informed them that they were already drunk, and for this reason, it was time for them to give up alcohol. She smiled and said that she would serve them soup for free instead. The young ladies looked at each other with joyful smiles. The lady smiled and asked the girl if she could take the order to the third table. Ethel said with a smile that she would do everything, and also gave her sister the newspaper because she had already finished reading it. The young lady walked slowly towards the table when her friend froze halfway. She was shocked because she realized that the Imperial Knights were now at the front who had come to her again. Ethel walked closer to the crater and asked what he would like to order. The young man sighed heavily, but did not answer. She looked at him fearfully, wondering if he suspected that she was a real princess. The young lady looked at the young man with a smile and called him over. A moment later, he said that he would choose the dish of the day. She smiled and informed him that the dish included mushroom soup and baked turkey. A moment later, she sighed heavily. She knew she needed to calm down, or he would definitely suspect something. He looked at her and asked if she could recommend him a suitable wine. Ethel said that the lightest wine they have is Night Dew. She said that if he wasn't worried about the price, she could also recommend him the Snow White Saint. A moment later, the knight informed her young lady of his choice. She thanked him for the order with a smile and said that she would bring it to him now. The knight looked intently after the young lady. Some time later, the young lady was leisurely collecting an order for the knight. The madam looked at her with a smile and asked if she knew that the knight had fallen in love with her. She looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The madam smiled and informed her that the knight looked at her intently every time she was busy or looked back. Madame informed her that even when she accepted the order and turned away, he also continued to watch her. Ethel smiled and asked if there was anything else besides looks. Madame smiled and said there were only looks. She looked closely at the young lady and said that the knight would definitely return to them. A moment later, a man entered their room and said with a smile that he was thinking about it too. The madam hugged the young lady with a smile and said that time flies very quickly and their girl already has a suitor. Ethel thought for a moment and remembered the day her aunt and uncle found her. One nightmarish day, they extended their hand to her. That day, she told them that she had nowhere to go. The madam asked the young lady with a smile if she would like to stay and live with them in that case. Ethel in turn burst into tears. She was surprised that she was asked to stay. That day she felt care and warmth. And then she had a family. She sighed heavily because she knew that this was her real family and her real home, which she did not want to lose. The young man sighed heavily because he knew that they were very similar, but unfortunately, he was not sure of it. The young man looked closely at the Duke and said that although there was some similarity between the girls, such an appearance was still very common. The young man knew that there was a lot of false information circulating right now. The Duke sighed heavily, but said nothing. The young man looked intently at the Duke and timidly asked him if he believed that the princess was still alive. The young man knew that almost 10 years had passed. At first, everyone decided that this was another attempt to assassinate the imperial family, but everything turned out differently. Unfortunately, even after the mutiny that had taken place, signs of new catastrophes continued to appear. People hoped that the princess blessed by the stars had survived after all. But there were also those who thought that she had died because otherwise it was impossible to explain the reason why all the stars suddenly disappeared above the palace. The young lady in turn slowly looked out the window. She stared at the palace, which was shrouded in emptiness, for there was not a single star above it. Late in the evening, the young lady sat quietly and read a book. While reading the book, she was taken aback when she heard someone calling her. She heard a voice whispering to her that she was the chosen one. With lightning speed, she rose and opened the window. The voice told her that they were looking for her and that she must go and take back what belonged to her. The young lady sighed heavily because she did not know what belonged to her. She did not know if her place was really there. The emperor, in his fury, asked his daughter, who had conspired with the rebels. He wanted her to go immediately and identify them. She screamed that she couldn't do it, and also said that she also wanted to hear the star's voice. The emperor shouted at her in his rage and called her names. He shouted that she was not even pretty, and for this reason she was of absolutely no use. She froze when she saw her brother, who was eavesdropping on them. But a moment later she saw her father approaching her and her brother running away. The young lady was scared. She understood that she was absolutely alone, and no one could help her. The emperor angrily asked his wife if the girl was really his child, since she was of no use. Stella turned around because she heard someone's footsteps. Stella froze in place as she saw her sister, the princess, furiously told her sister that it was all because of her. She told Stella that it was simply useless and good for nothing. The emperor informed his daughter that from that day on, she would serve Karen, as there was only one way to receive the same honorable treatment as her sister. At that moment in her life, the young lady completely forgot her name. She looked sideways at her sister, who was having fun. Then she ceased to exist for the world. Ethel sighed heavily and said that if they had let her hear the voices earlier, everything would have been different. With lightning speed, the young lady closed the window. She knew that she would never return to that place again. She was well aware that she was now in a house and living a good life. The next morning, the young lady and her sister were sitting and having a casual conversation. Daisy asked her sister with a smile if there was a continuation of the story about the princess who was an ugly duckling. Ethel said with a smile that the story had a sequel, but it was not at all interesting. Once upon a time, there lived a father, a king, a mother, a queen, a sister, and a brother, together with an ordinary ugly duckling princess. The princess duck received a lot of hatred because there was nothing special about the poor thing's birth. But one day, the not-so-beautiful princess met a special duck. He was a brave man and the best swordsman in the kingdom. He was also a very nice duck and sometimes gave her apples and smiled. The two ducks became very close, but one day the brave duck stopped coming. Daisy asked her sister excitedly why this had happened. Before Ethel could answer, they suddenly heard a knock on the door. The madam looked at the young lady with a radiant smile and asked her to go down to the first floor. Ethel looked at her aunt in bewilderment, as she did not understand why there was such a rush. The young lady slowly descended, but a moment later she shuddered and froze in place. She was puzzled because she clearly saw a knight in front of her. The young lady looked at the knight in bewilderment and asked why he had come. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to purchase several bottles of wine, which she had recently recommended to him. She looked at the knight with a smile and said that he should wait a little, and she would bear everything for him. The lady said with a smile that she could bring everything since she was going to the warehouse anyway. A moment later, Madame left them, and the young people stood puzzled in the silence. The young man looked at her intently and apologized for distracting her during the break. Ethel looked closely at the knight, as at first she had only noticed the imperial emblem, but she noticed that he was very handsome. She froze for a moment and looked intently at the knight because she realized that he was very similar to one man. She flinched when he looked at her because she realized she had made a mistake. The young lady said with a smile that he had not distracted her since it was almost time to cook dinner anyway. The knight looked closely at Ethel and asked if he could know her name. She looked at the knight in surprise, as she had not expected anything like this at all. A moment later, she timidly looked away from him and said her name. Looking at the young man, she asked his name. A moment later, he announced that his name was Clyde. She sighed heavily and said that it was a very rare name. She froze for a moment because looking at the knight, she realized that he had the same name as the boy. He looked at her intently and asked how she knew. Ethel asked in bewilderment what he was talking about. Clyde said that his name is indeed not very common among the aristocrats, but information about this is unacceptable to commoners. The young lady bowed with lightning speed and asked for forgiveness. She said that all her life, she had only heard the names of common people, so his name seemed unusual to her. She sighed heavily and said, trembling, that this was the first time she had learned that it was not common among the aristocracy. The young man looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. A moment later, a young man burst in and informed the knight that he had an appointment and needed to hurry. The young lady looked at the knight in surprise, as she realized that he was a duke. She realized that now in front of her was a completely different person, because she knew that an Arab could not become a duke. A moment later, the duke came closer to her and paid her. As he handed over the coins, he touched her hand, and the young lady recoiled in horror, looking at the knight. Ethel knew perfectly well that this looked very strange, but she was now very nervous. She looked at the gold coins in surprise. She looked at the duke in surprise and said that the price was only 4 gold coins, not 5. He looked at her intently and said that the rest was for her, recommending him a good wine. He said her name with a smile. Some time later, the duke arrived at the palace. The young man informed the duke that the appointed time had long since passed, and they had kept her waiting. He said the duke should smile as an apology. Looking at the duke, he said that he had done well before, but he did not understand why some tavern maid had interested him so much. The duke looked angrily at his assistant and said that he had been talking too much lately. Peter bowed low and told the duke that he would be more considerate in future. Karen looked at the duke with a joyful smile. She ran up to the duke with lightning speed and greeted him with a radiant smile. A few seconds later, she threw herself on his neck. The duke looked at the young princess with cold fury because he did not like this at all. She looked at the duke with a radiant smile and said that she missed him very much. Some time later, they were sitting in the garden, drinking tea. While drinking tea, the princess told the duke that the emperor very much hoped that they would be able to get married soon. Looking at the duke, Peter said that all the soldiers and servants of his estate were awaiting the arrival of the new mistress. With lightning speed, the duke rose and furiously asked the princess if this was the reason she had called him. The princess saw that the young man was in a bad mood today. She knew that she needed to find out what happened. She said with a smile that he would be very busy helping the emperor. She said that she seemed to have disturbed him and very much hoped that he did not hold it against her. The Duke sighed heavily and told the princess that if she had nothing more to say, he would leave. She looked closely at the Duke and informed him that he was the best candidate for prince. The princess looked at the Duke with a smile and said that the Emperor thought the same. The Duke turned to her, intently looked at her. The princess smiled and told him that she thought the same. The princess looked at the Duke with a radiant smile and said that they all thought so. He looked at the princess with cold fury but did not answer. A moment later, the princess began to speak, but he turned around with lightning speed and walked away. The Duke asked for forgiveness and said that he had to leave already. Peter asked the princess for forgiveness and hurried after the Duke. The princess looked after the Duke with cold fury because she wanted to kill him and wanted to possess him. Some time later, Peter came up to her princess and called her. Bowing, he asked for forgiveness and informed her that he needed to tell her something very important. The young princess looked intently at the young man and told him to follow her. Some time later, they came to a secluded place, and she said that he could now speak. Having bowed, the young man informed the princess that the Duke had recently been interested in a certain girl. The princess was taken aback because she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently and asked what he was talking about. At the same time, the Duke was sitting in his domain and quietly sipping wine. After a few minutes, he slowly approached the portrait. He looked intently at the portrait of the previous Duke. From bastard to slave, from the prince's opponent in the narrative to the monster who causes atrocities, from the hero of the empire to the Duke. He remembered how the Duke had said with fury that such a man had no right to live in his house. Clyde looked at his father's portrait with a grin and told him that he was now a candidate for prince. He remembered the day when he personally stabbed his father to death with a sword. He knew that his father was just a dirty pig who was ruining a great family. He sighed heavily, for he knew that what he had wanted was not to receive the title. He remembered the young girl who protected him. He remembered her with a smile, as she always stood up for him. He looked out the window at the stars, knowing that they were still his guiding star. At the same time, the young lady lay quietly in bed. The young lady suddenly remembered how she touched the knight, and how he called her by name with a gentle smile. A moment later she sighed heavily, and the wind decided to push all thoughts away and not think about him anymore. She sighed heavily as she remembered his name. It brought her back to her memories. She knew that Clyde was the only one who cared about her suffering. Karen walked into her brother's room and called him over with a smile. The prince looked closely at his sister and called her. He sighed heavily and said that he was curious about what Stella really looked like. He knew that it didn't matter how much time had passed. The princess looked at her brother in surprise and said that he had been thinking about their sister a lot lately. He sighed heavily and said that he felt as if he had completed a terrible crime. He knew that he should have stopped then. He said that if things had been different, they would have found her by now. He knew that he shouldn't have left her in the first place. The young princess looked at her brother and said that it was not his fault at all. She sighed heavily and said that if that was the case, then it was all done in the name of the empire, and the existence of the youngest princess had to be hidden. She looked at her brother intently and said that otherwise the entire imperial family would still be ridiculed because of a pathetic empty shell. The prince looked at his sister with puzzlement and said that she was, after all, their younger sister. The princess, looking at her brother, asked him to stop such conversations because if he continued to blame himself, it would not change anything. The prince sighed heavily but did not answer his sister. The princess, looking at her brother, understood perfectly well that he was very boring. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly on the street and reminisced about the past. The ladies were surprised that the princess's personal maid was present in the portrait of the imperial family. The aristocrats were surprised and puzzled that a servant girl had been given such an honor, and they thought it was very strange. Looking at the girl, the ladies said that she was like a sparrow that had been caught in the rain, as if she would strike among the flowers. Daisy smiled and told her sister that she was very sleepy. Sitting outside, they admired the beautiful stars. Daisy said with a smile that the stars were like little rays of light. Ethel asked with a smile if she really liked them so much, and she also said that they were also called tears of heaven. Daisy asked her sister, in surprise, why they were called that. Ethel said with a gentle smile that it was because they were not as important as, for example, the blinding sun or the shining moon. Daisy disagreed with her sister's opinion. She said that if there were no stars, travelers would not be able to find their way at night. The young lady looked at her sister intently as she was caught by her sister's words. The young lady thought for a moment and remembered her parents, who were constantly arguing about her. The princess looked at Peter and said that he could now tell her everything. The young man sighed heavily and said that the Duke had fallen into the wasteland's web. The princess looked at the young man with surprise and confusion and asked what he was talking about. The princess looked closely at her maids and informed them that she was heading to Viscount Evandor's. At the same time, all the aristocrats admired the young man. The young man looked at everyone present with a radiant smile as he felt embarrassed by their praise. A moment later, he turned around as he heard someone calling him. The princess looked at the young man with a radiant smile and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He said with a smile that it seemed like she missed him since she came. Sometime later, they were sitting in the room having a casual conversation. He asked in surprise if this was all for real. The richest man in the empire, unrequited love of all the ladies, a natural genius, self-proclaimed best man in the empire, who masterfully and used beautiful words. But the princess knew very well that he was a true womanizer and a liar, and his kindness and sincere smile were just a fake. The princess looked closely at the young man and said that everything was exactly like that. She sighed heavily and said that there was a girl who worked in the tavern, and she looked a lot like Stella. He sighed heavily and informed the princess that the portrait published in the press did not necessarily have to be identical to the original. The princess said that she was told that the girl looked very much like her sister, so she was sure. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked who told her about this. The princess looked at him intently with a smirk on her face. A moment later, she said that her future husband told her about it. Jason looked at the princess in surprise, but said nothing. A moment later, he asked with a grin if she would be back. The princess looked closely at the expensive drink. Jason smiled as he began to refill her glass. He said it couldn't be any other way since she was here. He said with a smile that the first beauty of the empire had decided to visit him, and that was why he was being treated. The princess looked at her companion with a smile and said that there was no sincerity coming from him. Jason told the princess that he still expected her to tell him a story. He wanted to know everything about the girl and also what the princess was going to do about it. The princess sighed heavily and said that she was tired of watching her family constantly search for an already dead man. She said that if the Duke could find someone so similar to the fictional portrait, then they could take advantage of it. Jason looked at the princess and asked what would happen if the real princess was still alive. Jason looked at the princess intently and asked if she really wanted him to help her with this. The princess said with a smile that everything was exactly like that, and they had no other choice because it was all for the sake of her beloved family. Karen told Jason that once the girl was in the palace, he had to make sure she trusted him completely. He asked in surprise what exactly she meant. The princess said that she wanted him to make the girl an obedient puppet. He sighed heavily and said that he did not steal women's hearts at all, since such stories do not have a happy ending. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked if nobility had really taken hold of him. He said with a grin that she should be more careful with her words because they were not on the same level. The young princess was furious because she understood that money decides everything in the world. He looked at the princess with a grin and said that he would certainly do everything in his power. Sometime later, a young lady was tidying up the warehouse. She carefully reached for a jar that was on the very top. The young man slowly approached her and asked if he could help her. But unfortunately, the young lady dropped the jar out of fright. She looked at the young man in surprise after the jar broke with a crash. He smiled and asked the young lady if she was hurt. Ethel looked at the young man in surprise and asked who he was. He introduced himself with a smile, saying that his name was Jason Evan Dors, but his friends often called him Jay. The young lady was wary, but she looked at the young man, as she realized that his luxurious clothes indicated that he was an aristocrat. He extended his hand with a smile, as he wanted to help her, and Ethel thanked him for his help, puzzled. A moment later, with his help, she slowly descended to the ground. Jason said with a smile that he was either eating at the belt, so he wanted to know her name. She bowed and said her name was Ethel. Jason said with a smile that it was a very beautiful name. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew she could not tell her real name. He looked at her with a smile and said that she didn't need to be afraid at all, since he was not a bad person at all. Ethel looked at the young man intently, for she was familiar with his smile. She understood perfectly well that his smile meant a smile, as if he were wearing a mask. He smiled and said that he actually came to her because he had a small favor to ask of her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He smiled and said that he could assume that she had already heard about the second missing princess. The young lady, in turn, shuddered after his words. He said that he had a very advantageous offer for her. The young lady, in turn, stepped back in fear and stepped on the shards of a broken can. The young man shouted at her not to move. With lightning speed, he came closer to her and took her in his arms. The young lady was taken aback and screamed as she wanted him to let her go. Jason asked with a smile if there was any medicine around here. The young lady looked closely at the young man, who was courteously treating her wound. He smiled and said that they were lucky, and her cuts were shallow. Jason said he gave her first aid, but she still needs to take care of herself in the coming days, and not put any strain on her leg. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him. He smiled and asked if he could return the favor, since she was so grateful to him. She asked for forgiveness because she was just an uneducated commoner. He looked at her intently and said that for starters, she should keep her mouth shut because it was a secret. A moment later, she sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that he could tell her. He looked at her in surprise as he realized that she grasped everything very quickly. He remembered how the princess said that he should give the girl a couple of compliments, and she would immediately go to his feet. He remembered the princess saying that the girl had a standard appearance, but he saw now that the girl was beautiful. Jason looked at the young lady with a smile, as he could see that the princess was completely wrong about her. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting in the backyard, thinking about everything. Ethel told the young man that everything was clear about the appearance, but unfortunately she would not be able to influence the stars because she did not hear them. Jason smiled and said that it was no big deal since the princess had no powers. She was shocked because she didn't expect to hear something like that, but he said it was true because people who knew the princess personally had spoken about it. Daisy called out to her sister with a joyful smile. Ethel stepped back and came to herself, throwing all thoughts away. Daisy asked with a smile how the story about the duck princess ended. The young lady thought for a moment about the ending of the tale. She said that gradually, the painful memories of the palace were forgotten. And when after some time the princess decided to look at her reflection, she was very surprised. She was surprised because there was no ugly duckling in the mirror. Daisy asked in surprise if it was really a swan and not a duckling. Ethel smiled and said that it was not. She said that since she saw her own appearance in person in the mirror, she immediately fell in love with herself for who she was. Daisy sighed and said that it would be more interesting if there was a secret of birth in the fairy tale. Daisy told her sister that the duck was very brave, and also asked her sister if she had met it. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Jason told the young lady that he had already decided on her future, so she would not have to stay in the palace for long. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Jason looked at her with a smirk. A moment later, he said that the Duke of Clyde Terranhill would be her husband. Some time later, the young lady began cleaning, but various thoughts did not leave her head. She remembered the conversation with Jason, because she alone knew that his offer was very good. Jason said with a smile that the princess was very fond of her family. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what about her. Ethel was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Jason only continued to watch her with a smile. He looked at her with a smile and said that he would repeat once again that this was a very good offer for her. He smiled and said that he really hoped that she would make the right choice. The young lady looked intently at her family, but after a few seconds, her gaze turned to the door. She froze in shock as she saw a painfully familiar person. She was puzzled because a princess entered the establishment. She froze in shock and couldn't move as she saw her sister with a smirk on her face. A moment later, the young lady approached the princess and bowed low. Karen asked Ethel if she was a local worker. The young lady bowed and said that it was indeed so. The princess asked the girl to raise her head with a smile. She introduced herself. The young lady tensed up, wondering if the princess was really trying to figure out who she really was. The princess took the young lady's hand with a smile. Ethel froze in shock because she did not expect this. Karen said she came to meet Ethel, who worked here. She asked Julia where the girl was now. Ethel froze in surprise as she realized that the princess did not recognize her. With lightning speed, the young lady threw away the princess's hands. Karen froze in place in surprise. Ethel said with regret in her voice that someone as important as the princess should not touch a commoner. The princess said with a smile that their country rests on the shoulders of ordinary people, and as a princess, she must show attention to her people. The knights whispered among themselves and looked at each other. They were amazed that the princess was so respectful to ordinary people. Ethel, she saw the beautiful smile, the warm voice. She knew it was only natural to look at her with eyes like theirs. Karen looked at the young lady and asked her name. A moment later, the young lady said she was Ethel. The princess froze in surprise because she saw that the girl was very beautiful. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked if there was a living room in this place. Ethel said they didn't have such a place, but her room was quiet enough that they could talk there. With lightning speed, the young lady turned around. She said that her room was a little shabby, but still hoped that it would not bother the princess. The princess, in turn, looked at the young girl with surprise and bewilderment. A moment later, they finally arrived at the young lady's room. The princess looked at the girl with disdain. A moment later, she spread out her shawl and slowly sat down on the bed. She looked closely at the young lady and said that it seemed she already knew why she had come here. She looked at the lady intently and said that she was her only hope. Bursting into tears, the princess said that after her sister's disappearance, the entire royal family lost its peace. Ethel looked away from the princess and said that she was just an ignorant commoner and could not pretend to be a noble lady. Karen told Ethel that she could pretend she didn't remember her childhood, and no one would look at her manner because everyone knew she had lived outside the palace for a long time. Ethel bowed and said that she was very sorry because the princess might still be alive, and therefore she could not do anything. The princess, with the speed of lightning, approached the lady and, taking her by the face, called her. Karen told her that she doesn't know if she is alive or not, but because of the princess, the entire palace can't let go of the past. She looked at the young lady intently and said that even those she loved could not say goodbye to her. She asked the girl to make everyone forget her sister. Ethel knew she was real. She never had any rights, so she was told she was a fake, but now the fake was being asked to play the role of a princess. She sighed heavily and asked the princess if she loved her sister. The princess looked at the lady in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. But a moment later, she said with an innocent smile that, of course, she loved her. Ethel looked at the princess intently and asked how she could say such things so easily. She was shocked because the princess was offering to steal someone else's identity, which belonged to her sister, who could still be alive. Karen looked at the young lady with an innocent smile. and said that it was not like that at all. The princess, smiling, told the girl that her sister was definitely dead. The princess looked at the girl with a grin and told her not to ask how she knew this. She just knew it. Ethel looked at her sister with cold fury and asked how she knew. The princess looked at the young lady with fury, but did not answer. Ethel asked the princess for forgiveness because she was asked to leave the family, so she is very worried. And because of the worry, she could inadvertently offend the princess. She looked at the princess and said that as she loved her family, so she loved hers, and for that reason she asked not to take her family away from her. Ethel told the princess that she did not want to live like Princess Stella at all, because now she had nothing more important than her family. With the speed of lightning, she fell to her knees and began to beg the princess. The young lady, without sparing words, begged the princess and asked her to leave. The princess looked intently at the young lady and a moment later saw the entire room. At the same time, the young lady really hoped that she would be able to live the rest of her life in such a beautiful place. The princess looked at the girl menacingly and asked if it would not be better to build something else on this site instead of an inn. Looking at the young girl, she listed all the options. Ethel was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The princess looked at the girl with a grin and said that she could choose there. The young lady looked at the princess in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The princess said with a grin that this inn could easily be demolished, and then her family could suddenly disappear. The princess told the young lady with a smirk that she might be very angry right now, but she still had no choice. As she was leaving, the princess said that the girl should become a princess because that was the best decision. The princess told Ethel that she was giving her a week to think about it. Ethel said she didn't understand what choice was being discussed because she knew she didn't have one. She looked at the princess with disdain and said that she was suggesting such a thing when she herself was holding a knife to her throat. The princess looked at the girl with fury. Ethel mockingly told the princess that she had taken her family hostage, and now she was generously offering a choice. Ethel, looking at the princess, asked if everyone in the palace really missed the missing princess. She asked the princess with rage if this was really what should be done for the one she missed. The princess looked at her with fury, but she said that it seemed like she was really worried about Stella. The princess said in her fury that her dearest sister would thank her from heaven in tears. The princess looked at the young girl and said that she was acting so arrogantly, as if she had already become a second princess. Ethel, looking at the princess, said that she herself had said earlier that if she did this, she would be very useful to her. The princess looked at the young lady with fury. Ethel looked at the princess menacingly and said that she would become the second Princess Stella. The princess looked at the girl with fury and did not ask who she was being rude to. She asked with her fury whether her plebeian race was really so insignificant that it could not even distinguish good from bad. Ethel smiled and told the princess that she was very noble, and she believed that the princess would understand these ignorant commoners. The princess looked at the young lady with anger, barely containing her rage. She asked the girl if she really thought she could get away with this. Ethel, looking away, said that the first princess she remembered was very generous, respectful, and very modest. Ethel looked at the princess with a grin and said that she was completely different. Karen winced as she didn't expect to hear that. Ethel smirked and told the princess that she didn't want the guards outside to know about it. With lightning speed, the young lady rose and ran to the door, confidently walking. She said that they could go by carriage. The princess was shocked by her behavior. Ethel looked hard at the princess and informed her that she would rather have a hotel than a fertilizer store. A moment later, she hit the door, and it opened with a bang. The princess ran up to her and, grabbing her hand, shouted that the young lady was simply impudent. Ethel fell to the ground with a crash. Trembling, she told the princess that she was in pain. Sitting on the ground, she shouted to the princess that the arm she had twisted hurt very badly. The princess froze for a moment when she noticed that the knights were staring at her. The young people looked at the princess in surprise, as they did not expect this. With lightning speed, the princess pushed the girl away, and as she left, she looked at her with fierce contempt. As she left, the princess said with a grin that they were done for today. The young lady rose slowly after the princess left. She knew perfectly well that the imperial house, but was lost in its fantasies, because in order to get rid of greed, the princess hid behind a mask of hypocrisy. Ethel, in turn, did not want to stop being a victim of black remorse. She wanted to go and mercilessly destroy Stella, whom they had been searching for so persistently. The Duke glanced sideways at his assistant and asked if something had happened. Looking at the Duke, Peter informed him that Princess Stella had returned to the palace. The Duke looked at his assistant in confusion and asked what he had just said. The young man asked the Duke if he would go to the palace. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he would do it to me now. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he hadn't been looking for the second princess all this time. He asked in surprise if this was all because of that woman from the inn. The Duke sighed heavily but said nothing. The young man was puzzled and shouted that this simply could not be. He asked the Duke if anyone could really give their heart to someone like her. The Duke said to his assistant with cold fury that he was being too noisy now. The young man looked at the Duke in surprise, but said nothing. Some time later, the young lady and the princess were riding to the castle. She looked intently at the servants who ran up to them with lightning speed. Some time later, she was already at an audience with her relatives. The emperor looked at the young lady with a casual gaze and asked what she could tell them. The empress looked at her husband and said that the young lady had lost her memory. The emperor looked at the girl in bewilderment and said that she did not remember anything and could not send a star into the sky. He looked at his wife in bewilderment and asked how he could then believe that she was the real Stella. The young lady sighed heavily and did not answer them. Karen looked at her father hard and said she was very sorry and that she seemed to have spoken too soon. The princess sighed heavily and said with an innocent smile that it all happened because she missed her sister and she really hoped that sister would return soon. The empress looked closely at her daughter and informed her that she had made a lot of efforts, but it was all in vain. The emperor looked at his wife with fury and shouted that he had told her earlier to stop searching. The empress was furious. She did not understand why he was talking about this. Now she shouted that it was he who did not know what to do with the curse of the imperial palace and ordered to find her. The emperor shouted furiously at his wife that she was simply a stubborn person. He shouted that their daughter had long since left the world. The emperor shouted in his rage that Stella had been dead for a long time. Karen looked at her parents with a satisfied grin. She was pleased with this reaction. Ethel looked away sharply, and a moment later asked where the portrait of the imperial family that used to hang in the hall was now. She said that it was the only painting in which she was depicted. Ethel sighed heavily and said that after the one portrait made, there were others, but each time the artists came, they sent her away on very different errands. She sighed heavily and said that it would be a real miracle if that very portrait was still hanging in the hall. Everyone present froze in shock. The prince looked at his sister with puzzlement and asked if she hadn't said earlier that the girl had lost her memory. Ethel ran up to the emperor with lightning speed and called him. She asked if his left arm still hurt. Looking at the emperor, she shouted that he had been wounded by a bear while hunting a deer, and the emperor froze in shock. Looking at the empress, she asked how her insomnia was going. The lady told the empress that she had previously sought help from court doctors, but all efforts were in vain. The empress froze in shock. She did not understand how this could happen. The emperor rose up with lightning speed and rushed towards the girl. He looked at the princess with anger and asked if she had really told the girl everything. Ethel looked at the emperor intently, but said nothing. A moment later she called out and quoted his words. In the past, he said that she was a decoy who was supposed to make sure that the youngest princess was safe. The emperor froze in shock as he remembered what he had told her. She looked at her father intently and said that he had personally told her these words. The emperor looked at the young lady in shock Now he realized that she really was his daughter. Karen looked at the nth lady with puzzlement. Ethel looked at her sister closely and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. For a moment there was dead silence in the room. Ethel looked at her family and told them the good news that she was back home. Jason looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if the princess had returned. The man smiled and said that everything was exactly like that and that the atmosphere was very festive now. The young man said that the people were very eager to see Stella return the stars to the sky, and for this reason they were all gathering in the capital. The young man looked at his assistant with a grin and said that they would look at it soon. He looked at his assistant with a grin and said that he wanted to have a little fun. Jason said that he would immediately bet on the diamond mines of the Sutherland lands because he knew perfectly well that the girl would not be able to do anything. The young man was taken aback and told his master that he would remain silent in this situation because he knew that the master's bets were always winning. Jason sighed and looked at his assistant, saying that he was very bored with him. The man smiled and told his master that he refused to play with him, but the players at the casino would definitely show interest. The young man looked at his assistant with a playful smile, as he was undoubtedly right. The man smiled and said that no one in their right mind would give up the diamond mines. With lightning speed, Jason rushed to the casino. The man with a smile wished good luck to his master. Jason walked towards the casino at lightning speed. He was puzzled and kept thinking about the young lady. He was surprised because he didn't know how she managed to deceive the imperial family, but he understood perfectly well that she wouldn't be able to fool the heavens. He looked into the distance with a grin, as he was curious to see how much money he would win this time. The young lady sat quietly in her room after being dressed by her maids. The maids showered her with compliments and said that she was very beautiful and that her jewelry was elegant. They said that with such jewelry, she began to shine even brighter. The young lady looked at the maids and said that she wanted to be alone. They agreed with the young princess and left the room with the speed of lightning. The princess sighed heavily and looked at the bed. Memories suddenly came flooding back to her, and she remembered crying by her bed in the distant past. She sighed heavily as she realized that the truth had returned back to the palace. The young princess was sitting quietly in her room, but suddenly someone knocked. She thought that her brother had come to see her, and so she harshly told him that she was not in the mood to talk to him today. But a moment later, the door to the room opened. The young princess was furious. She shouted that he must leave. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw her sister in front of her. Ethel looked at the princess intently and said she had one question. Karen looked away from her sister and said that she did not want to listen to her and also told her sister to leave immediately. Ethel looked at the princess and said that the fairy had something interesting to say. Coming closer to the princess, she asked if it was true that sister had done such a monstrous thing because she could not bear to see her family suffer. The young princess shuddered, not knowing what to answer to this question. Ethel said coldly and calmly that it was probably not true, because she knew perfectly well that if it were true, I would be useless, a fake with no memory, or any abilities would definitely not be suitable for this role. She looked at her sister closely and said that was the reason she had chosen Ethel's pacifier. Ethel realized that her sister had found means to get rid of the real princess completely. Ethel sighed heavily and said that they wanted to use the fake again to make them let go of all their regrets. She looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that fortunately she had managed to deceive everyone. She knew that due to the incompetence of the replacement, who was a commoner to the core, the honor of the real princess would be trampled into the dirt. She looked at her sister with a grin and said that it was still a joy for them that they had managed to deceive everyone. The princess looked at her sister in bewilderment and shouted that she was simply impudent. Ethel walked up to her sister with lightning speed and looked at her menacingly and asked her if she should go and tell her that she had threatened her. She looked at the princess with cold fury and said that she could repeat everything word for word. Karen was in shock. She screamed at her sister that the only one she threatened was that commoner because she was worthless. Even her death would mean nothing. Ethel looked at her sister with cold fury and said that if anyone asked her why she did that to her sister, she could say that she didn't know it was her sister because she only saw a commoner. Ethel asked her sister in anger if that was really how she thought ordinary people should be treated. The princess looked at her sister with fury, but did not answer. Ethel looked at her sister as she saw very confused, but she had not even started yet. Karen looked at her in surprise and said that she seemed to have grown a lot. She looked at her sister with fury and said that she could say whatever she wanted because no one would believe her anyway. Karen looked at her with cold fury and asked who would listen to a girl who humiliated his palace and who spent her entire childhood as a commoner. She asked with a smirk if she really had her own people in this palace. The princess, with a haughty grin, told her sister that everyone here hated her. Ethel looked at her sister intently and calmly said that it was true her people had not been here all that time. She told her sister with a grin that there were many people here who had known her since her childhood. She said with a grin that she was known as the ideal, graceful, dignified first princess of the empire. Karen froze in shock, not knowing what to answer. Ethel, looking at her sister, asked if they hadn't already signed a contract. She looked at her sister with a grin and said that she now had in her hand a paper that contained her life and the life of her family. Ethel, with a grin, said that she now held a contract between two princesses. Karen was furious. She didn't expect anything like this at all. Ethel looked at her sister with disdain and said that she had deliberately shown herself to her guards then, and that for this reason even her closest ones would now know about her pretense. She looked at the princess with a smirk and said that it could happen again. She said that she knew her weaknesses very well. The princess looked at her sister with fury, but said nothing. Ethel, with a victorious smile, looked at her sister because she realized that she really wanted to save her pathetic reputation. She looked at the princess intently and said that she was interested in one question. She was surprised and did not understand what the reason for the choice could be for the princess who was possibly dead. Karen angrily said that the Duke himself demanded this in exchange for help in restoring her influence. Ethel looked at her in surprise, as she did not understand why he needed this. Karen shouted to her sister with irritation in her voice that the Duke apparently liked her. She looked at her sister with fury and asked what else could be taken from a slave who had been their brother's fencing partner as a child. Ethel froze in shock, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. Looking out the window, the young princess told her sister that she had to get ready as the sun would soon set, but she looked at her sister with a grin and said that she couldn't bring back the stars anyway. She looked at the young princess with fury and said that she would answer for her rudeness later. Ethel turned like lightning and walked towards the exit. She knew they would see what she was capable of. The young princess hurriedly went to her room. She was surprised and amazed because she now understood that it was he, her good duckling, the hero of empires, the Duke. The maid was whispering near the princess's room. They were saying that there were high stakes in the casino. The casino was betting on whether Princess Stella could return the stars to the sky. The young princess looked at the maids and said that she wanted to know more about these rumors. The young maids looked at each other in confusion and told the princess that the owner of the peaks was betting on her. They told the princess that he had bet on the diamond mines. Sometime later, the young lady arrived at the casino. Sometime later, the young lady slowly entered the central hall. She understood perfectly well that she was now in a casino that belonged to the Viscount. Walking down the long corridor, she saw all the delights of the casino. She looked around carefully as she realized how friendly the Viscount and the princess had become. She guessed that the royal treasury was depleted, but the gambling establishments were thriving. She understood that the young man provided for the imperial family, and the imperial family turned a blind eye to his behavior. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin and said that the bets were on the opposite side. He smiled and said that he would certainly accompany her, But the young princess did not listen to him and silently walked on. She walked slowly into the room and looked intently at the man. The man looked at her intently and asked what she would bet on. Ethel asked the man what the odds were at the moment. He looked at her hard and said that the odds were stacked against the stars not rising. She looked at him hard and asked what the odds were. The man said that if she bet 1 billion, she could get the diamond mines. The young lady glanced sideways at the pen. With lightning speed, she took it pen in hand and wrote down her bet. He looked at her intently and informed her that she had wasted 1 billion gold. He said with a grin that she should think again, as it was quite a lot of money. A moment later, the young people began to whisper behind her back because they knew that she would waste the money. The young lady looked at the man intently and informed him that she had changed her mind. A moment later, she corrected her check. She smirked and pushed the check towards him and said that it was still a game of chance. The man was taken aback for a moment. A moment later, he took the check in his hands and froze in shock. He could not believe what he saw. He was dumbfounded because she had put 10 billion and also provided a check from the Even Doors Bank. She looked at the man intently and said that she had heard that this was the best casino in the empire. The young princess sighed heavily and said that judging by his address to the honored guest, it seemed that this was not the case at all. The man was taken aback as he realized that he had made a huge mistake. With lightning speed, he bowed and asked his mistress for forgiveness. A moment later, he handed her the magic tool with her stake in it. He smiled and asked her to keep it carefully. The young lady looked closely at the small ingot in her hand. At the same time, the Duke was training at his estate. He was furious and remembered the day he brought the crown to the emperor. On that day, the emperor joyfully accepted the crown from his subject. He looked at the young man with a joyful grin and said that thanks to the brave sacrifices of the valiant knight, the imperial family was able to safely recover from the uprising. The emperor looked at his loyal subject with a fierce grin and said that he would give him everything he wanted. Then the young man wanted only one thing. He looked intently at the emperor and said that he should give him Princess Stella, the star of the empire. Now the young man was very puzzled and scared, but he knew that tonight he would find out whether the princess was real or not. The empress ran up to her daughter with a smile and said that she was very late today. The empress hugged her daughter and told her that she had very suddenly asked for a blank check and ran away. The empress sighed heavily and told her daughter that she thought she would never come back. The empress was puzzled. She told her daughter that she was afraid that she would disappear again. The young lady sighed heavily but did not answer. The maids looked at them intently as a very touching scene unfolded before their eyes. The young lady quietly told her mother that she had returned. She sighed heavily, for she knew that the words given to her were the most paradoxical she could ever utter. The empress looked intently at her daughter and asked her to look at her. A moment later, the empress told her daughter that they had to go quickly because everyone was waiting for her. The young lady looked at her mother intently. She was curious, and at the same time, she wondered if her mother would have had a loving face if she had not been able to return the stars. Ethel walked slowly past her family without even looking at anyone. A moment later, she opened the window onto the terrace and stepped out with lightning speed. For a moment, the young lady froze in place as she saw a crowd of people shouting and chanting her name. She was a little surprised by such a crowd of people. The prince looked closely at his sister and with tenderness in his voice, said that she could do anything. She sighed heavily, as she did not want to live up to their expectations at all. But in turn, she understood perfectly well that she had to do it. The young princess slowly reached out to the stars. Everyone looked intently at the princess. Karen looked at her sister with a grin because she knew that she would not succeed. Ethel knew full well that even though she was back, she would no longer be who they wanted to see. She knew she had to use her status to protect the people in Ethel's name. Karen froze in shock, knowing that this simply couldn't be happening. But a moment later, the young lady was illuminated by light. She reached out to the beautiful stars, and they answered her. Everyone present was shocked as they realized that their princess was real. and she had returned the stars to them. They shouted that she had returned to protect their empire. The young lady, in turn, gazed at the stars as if enchanted. Everyone present looked at the stars with awe. The young princess, in turn, sighed heavily and began to cry. She now realized that she had truly returned. The Duke froze for a moment, looking at the young princess. He was stunned and realized that she had really returned. He looked at her intently and whispered her name softly. The next day, the young lady met the Viscount. She slowly handed him a small object, which confirmed her bet. He looked at her in surprise, because he knew that he had lost his diamond mines. He also called her princess. She smiled and asked the Viscount, "Isn't it the same? They say it as a sign of respect." She said that she was very sorry that he could no longer say these words. The young lady slowly poured tea for herself and the Viscount. She looked closely at the young man, for she knew that he was the richest businessman in the empire. And one could even say that he was the richest businessman on the entire continent. She was well aware that half of his entire income came from diamond mines. The young lady sighed heavily and said that if he had finished reading the document, he could sign it because she would gratefully accept the diamond mine. The young man looked at her in surprise and said that her side's son was a pure scam because she was a princess and had bet a huge amount of money on herself, and now she was demanding dividends. She looked at the young man in surprise and said that she never thought she would hear this from the man who agreed to place a bet, knowing that she was a fake. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that she had been made a scapegoat without her consent. She looked closely at the Viscount and said that she did not like this at all. Ethel, looking at the Viscount, said that if he did not give her everything honestly, then she would decide this at the imperial level. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she didn't seem to know why the place had stayed afloat for so long. Ethel coldly replied that she knew the reason, because it was supported by Princess Karen. She looked at the Viscount with a smile and said that the princess supported him, but not she. Ethel looked at the young man with a smirk and said that what people wanted most was the casino, so they could cheat even the princess herself. She looked at him intently and asked with a smirk if that wasn't true. He looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected to hear something like that. Rereading the document, she asked if he really didn't understand what she was talking about. She looked intently at the young man and said insistently that he owed her a lot of money. Ethel looked at the young man intently, for she knew he was just Karen's dog. Jason had always been the one she least wanted to deal with, but she knew this was a very good chance to get even with the Evandors. She looked at the young man intently, as she knew perfectly well that she had to take advantage of this chance because she needed strength. A moment later, the young princess said that they could compromise, and instead of the mines himself, he could pay an amount equal to their value. Jason stood frozen in surprise, not expecting such a thing. Ethel said that, however, she would be at a loss if she received the money in this way, because it was the same as taking one golden egg from the hen that lays them, but leaving the hen herself. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she really wanted. She looked at him hard and said she wanted the current value of the mines and 40% of all profits every month. Jason looked at her in surprise and said that 40% was too much. She looked at the Viscount with cold fury and asked if she should really take all the mines without leaving a trace. A moment later, they began to haggle. Jason looked at the princess with a puzzled look and asked if it would not be better for them to find a compromise rather than argue with each other. He said that he could give her 20% and she would also have to give him a few hours of her time. The princess looked at him intently and said that she agreed, but she would also invest her dividends in the casino. She said that he should invest half of it in the business and give half to the people who lost money. The Viscount looked at her in surprise and asked what she thought about the fund being in her name. She smiled and said that it was a good option. She looked at the Viscount intently and said that he was a businessman, and naturally it was better to use the money than to give it to her. She said that all the calculations were easy for him. She looked at the young man closely and asked if Sutherland had belonged to the Evendores since the time of their ancestors. She said she didn't think the mines would ever be destroyed, even as a symbol of a bygone era. Jason sighed heavily and said she was right, and he was delighted. The princess looked at the young man intently and said that for this reason, she very much hoped that he would manage the mine properly and fill her pockets with all the knowledge he had accumulated. He looked at the young princess with a smile and said that of course he would do it. He handed her a contract and told her that she had to sign it, and then it would become valid. The young lady rose slowly and walked around the room, saying that she wanted to tell him something before she left. She sighed heavily as she signed the contract and said that all negotiations were with her consent, and that meant that she had given in. The princess looked coldly at the young man and said that he should be grateful for the concession. She looked at him with disdain and threw him the signed contract and said that the next time they met, she hoped he would show his respect as a loser to a winner. The young man froze in shock, looking at the princess because he did not expect this. He saw her cold face. A moment later, the princess left, leaving him alone. Jason was puzzled. He could not utter a word and sat quietly while the princess left. At the same time, in the imperial palace, the emperor, with pleasure, recalled the day when his daughter returned the stars to their place. He remembered how everyone shouted. He admired the recognition of the common people. He remembered the moment when he stood surrounded by people, and they glorified him. The emperor realized that his daughter had managed to revive the empire. He was surprised because his ugly duckling had truly been reborn. But a moment later, his face changed. The emperor was furious because he knew that if he had discovered her abilities a little earlier, the people would have supported him, and he would have been able to overthrow all the aristocrats. He remembered that turning point when they lived like ordinary people. Then he was very surprised because one fine day, a knight came to him, carrying a crown in his hand. With the speed of lightning, the emperor ran up to the young man and froze next to him. The emperor was furious, as he knew that if he had discovered her powers earlier, he would not have been in debt to that monster. A moment later, he heard a noise and looked at the door with joy because he thought that his daughter Stella had come to see him. After a while, his face changed as he noticed that it was Karen. The princess looked at her father with a smile and said that she heard that he was looking for her. In a hurry, he asked her to move as they were about to have a conversation. She looked at her father closely and told him that she knew he had called her because of her sister. Karen sighed heavily and said that she knew perfectly well that she had been stupid and that she shouldn't have found her sister so early. But she was puzzled because no one knew that sister was right under their noses. The emperor sighed heavily, and a moment later he began to speak, but his daughter interrupted him. She smiled and told her father that if he wanted to thank her, he didn't have to do it at all, because it was what she had to do as a loving daughter and sister. The emperor, with a hint of irritation in his voice, looked intently at his daughter and said that he wanted to ask where she found it. The young princess looked at her father in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The emperor said that he must certainly repay the people who took care of his daughter with gold status and lands, as he had promised earlier. The young lady slowly looked away from her father, not knowing what to say, but a moment later she said that she found her sister on the street. The emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like this. She looked at her father and said with a smile that he shouldn't dwell on it at all. And after all, their princess had returned to them, and that was the most important thing. With the speed of lightning, the emperor took his hand from his daughter and leaving said that he understood her. The young lady in turn was furious as she felt a disgusting feeling. She was furious because she realized that her sister had now become like her and had powers of her own. Karen was furious. She knew that she still had support in the person of the Viscount. She understood that if she told the young man, he would immediately sort everything out. Some time later, the young princess met the Viscount. Jason greeted the princess according to all the rules of etiquette. She looked at the young man intently, but said nothing. and he in turn looked at her with cold fury, for he knew that he had to bow before her. A moment later, the young man's expression changed, and he thanked the princess with a smile for giving him her precious time. With tenderness in his voice, he sincerely asked for forgiveness for all his past actions. He looked closely at the princess, and with a sly, sweet smile, asked if she forgave him. Ethel, in turn, looked intently at the young man, but did not answer his question. A moment later, he said that she had been presented with a cup of premium tea and asked if she would like to try it. The princess sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that she did not want to do this. Having asked for forgiveness, he walked towards her. With lightning speed, the young man took the cup and drank the tea in front of her. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to see something like this. A moment later, he said with a smile that there was no poison in the cup. He looked at her with a playful grin and said that she was now his special client. He looked intently at the young princess and said that he was an entrepreneur, and he in turn is not so stupid as to harm the owner of the star, the favorite of the imperial family, and the entire people. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the young man. But a moment later, the princess said that no one knew the plans of man, and she must be on guard. He looked at the princess intently, and with a gentle smile, said that from the expression on her face, he dared to assume that she was counting how many minutes had already passed. He smiled and asked if she still hated him. The princess looked at the young man intently, as it was funny. She remembered that earlier he looked at her with a look full of menace. Jason smiled and asked for forgiveness and told the princess that he did not want to anger her at all and she should believe him. The princess looked closely at the young man. She understood that for him, taking on a friendly image was like turning over a mask. The princess looked at the Viscount intently and asked how much his contract with Princess Karen was worth. Jason looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Ethel looked away from him, sighed heavily, and said that only a day had passed, and he already seemed to have become a different person. She looked at him intently and said that for this reason, it was interesting to know the price of his union with the princess. Jason looked at the princess in surprise and intently, as he did not expect to hear anything like that at all. The princess looked at him coldly and said that she must be careful with these pissers, whose masks could be pulled off so easily. For a moment there was a dead silence between them. Ethel, after a short pause, said that she heard, "He maintains a large army of mercenaries in the Empire." He smiled and proudly said that everything was absolutely correct. The princess sighed heavily and said that this was very good because protection was important. He looked at the princess with a smile and asked if it was all because of that temporary family. He asked the princess with a smirk on his face if her real family knew about this fact. The princess froze in place for a moment. He looked at her intently and said that she should still protect those relatives. The princess looked at him with cold fury but did not answer. A moment later, a maid came up to them. Jason asked the maid to bring them more tea. After the maid brought them tea and left, the princess looked at him intently and said that if she said something provocative, everything would be revealed at once. Ethel looked at him intently and asked if he was really going to manipulate her to know about her weakness. He smiled and asked the princess how this was possible. She looked at the Viscount with cold fury and said that if he dared to touch her family with even a finger, he could irrevocably lose his special client, as well as the trust of the people. She looked at the Viscount and said he will also lose the most important thing, the dignity of the Evandors. Jason looked at the princess intently, but did not answer. She looked at him with cold fury and said that she would do everything possible to make it happen. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that he should have kept quiet after all. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that if he had kept quiet, there would not have been such an awkward tension between them now. A moment later, he asked the princess how he could introduce the mercenaries. She looked at him with a smile as he understood everything. Ethel said she only wanted 3 able people, and it would be nice if they could do the housework well. The lady called her husband with a smile and said that he should look at the young people. The man froze in shock. He looked at the huge young men who were frightening just by their appearance with bewilderment. Hans looked at the young people with puzzlement and asked who they were. Madame looked at her husband with a joyful smile and said that the young people needed work, and they said that instead of money, they would have enough food and a roof over their heads. Madame was very happy since they were just short of workers. Hans was shocked by his wife. Looking at the innkeepers, the young people shouted what they could do. The young man hugged his friend and said with a smile that he cut meat very well and chopped wood very well. The man took the firewood with lightning speed and told the gentleman that he would do everything carefully. Hans looked at the young men in surprise and said that they were better suited to work as bodyguards than in their inn. Hans said with a smile that the bodyguard's salary was tens of times higher. The young man smiled and said that this was the princess's order, but his friend interrupted him and said that money was not important to them, as there were things more important than it. He smiled and said that since childhood he had dreamed of working in a tavern. The lady said with a joyful smile that it was just a wonderful dream and they should support him. The young man smiled happily. A moment later, Daisy came running downstairs hearing the noise. She looked at the young people with intense surprise and asked who they were. The young man, with the speed of lightning, picked up the girl and offered to carry her around his neck. She happily threw herself into his arms. Hans wanted to take his daughter back because he knew that she could easily torture the young man. A moment later, they all turned and stared at the young man and greeted him. Daisy looked at the handsome knight with a smile. The Duke quickly but carefully looked around the establishment. Madame and Sir bowed and asked for what purpose such a respected person visited them. He looked at them intently and asked where Ethel was. They glanced at each other and told the Duke that she had left without even telling him where she was going. A moment later, the man handed him the book and said that the girl had left only a note. She wrote that she would explain everything to them later, but for now they should not worry. He looked at them closely and asked if they had any idea where she might have gone. Madame sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they had no guesses or assumptions. She looked at the Duke with a puzzled, intent look and asked if something had happened, and she left them. The Duke was furious. He knew that this anxiety was like lava before an eruption. He understood that he would go mad if he did not return her. He wondered if he should draw his sword. The Duke knew perfectly well that if he started waving the bloody weapon like a madman, then someone would tell him where Ethel was. He sighed heavily as he realized that he was very afraid of hearing the truth. He understood perfectly well that the answer was right under his nose. The Duke knew that all he needed was to muster up the courage, but unfortunately, he was beating around the bush and couldn't bring himself to do it. He was puzzled because he did not know what to do if suddenly young Ethel did not turn out to be Stella. Looking at the Duke, the young man asked where to take him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they were heading to the palace. The young lady was sitting quietly in her room when suddenly a maid knocked on the door. The princess looked at the maid in surprise and asked if her sister had really been at the meeting with the Viscount. The maid looked at the princess with alarm and said that this was not a simple meeting because the Viscount invited the princess into the living room and even treated her to the highest quality tea. The princess said with a smile that the Viscount treated everyone well. The maid informed her that he also ordered the princess to be escorted to the carriage. Karen suddenly thought and remembered when the Viscount told his servant to take her to the carriage. The princess was furious, and because she understood that he was the same impudent man who always told her what to do and drove her away as quickly as possible. She was furious because she knew he was a scoundrel for putting her sister above her. With the speed of lightning, she turned to the maid and patted her on the head with a smile. She thanked the maid and called her Becky. The maid looked at the princess with confusion and said that her name was Anne. The princess, with a radiant smile, asked the maid for forgiveness. She said that she was very tired, and that was why she made a mistake. Anne, with a smile and joy, thanked the princess for paying attention to her. She told the princess that she also wanted to be as graceful and noble a girl as the princess. As she left, the princess said with a smile that all this was possible, and also thanked her and called her Becky again. The maid quickly said that her name was different, but the princess did not listen to her and only wished her a good day. At the same time, the young princess was sitting in her room and quietly writing a letter to her family. She wanted to know how they were doing. She wrote how much she missed their warmth. The young princess remembered those wonderful moments when she was with her family. But a moment later, she was taken aback without finishing the letter because she felt that there was someone behind her. With lightning speed, she hid her letter and turned around. She was taken aback when she saw the young maid behind her. The maid bowed low and asked the prince's forgiveness for having disturbed her. The maid quietly said that the princess had a very sad look and she was worried about that. The princess sighed heavily and told the young maid with a smile that she was just thinking about something. The maid said happily that in that case, it was very good. Ethel looked closely at the young maid. It seemed to her that she was with Daisy the same year. She looked at the maid with sadness because she saw that she was very small and harmless, but still she understood that she had to be careful. A moment later, her sister burst into her room. Ethel looked at the maid intently and told her that she could leave them. The maid ran out of the room with lightning speed. Karen sat down on the sofa very quickly. Looking at her sister, she said that she should sit closer, sighing heavily. The princess said that usually the guest is served tea. Ethel put aside all her business, went up to her sister, and said that she clearly had not come to see her. She asked her sister if something had happened. Karen looked at her sister with cold fury and said that it was not proper for a princess to speak like that. Ethel interrupted her sister before she could finish and said that she had only recently returned to the palace. She looked at the princess intently and said that she could be forgiven, at least this time. Karen shouted furiously that she would not tolerate this. Ethel, looking at her sister, said that she was still a very kind princess, and of course she would forgive her, and she thanked her for her kindness. Karen looked at her sister in anger and said that they should stop this meaningless chatter. She sighed heavily and irritably told her sister that she had told her parents that she had picked her up on the street. Karen said that she wasn't at all sure whether the operator would reward or punish her family. For this reason, she said that she found her on the street. Ethel, looking away from her sister, said that she simply did not want to let go of such a trump card as her weakness. Karen told her sister irritably that she was completely misinterpreting other people's good deeds. She said with fury in her voice that a princess should not have such a character trait. Ethel sighed heavily and told her sister that she did not need such a good relationship. As she left, she said that she would simply go to her father and tell him everything. But her sister screamed and ordered her to sit down. Ethel, in turn, did not listen to her sister. She simply continued walking. But a moment later, the princess ran up to her sister and grabbed her hand. Ethel came closer to her sister and called her name. After a short pause, she looked at the princess with contempt and asked why she was lying so brazenly. Karen, in turn, froze for a moment. The young princess was taken aback by her sister's words. A moment later, she came to her senses and shouted to her sister that she too did not want their father to find out about this. The princess screamed furiously that she had not sent them a single letter. Ethel pushed her sister's hand away with lightning speed. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that her presence here was necessary, and the imperial family would do everything to keep her. She looked at her sister intently and said that this was the reason why it was all hidden, because it was important. Karen looked at her sister with a smile and said that this was a very good excuse. She looked at her sister with disdain and asked if, when she returned to the palace, she liked it here so much that she completely forgot to write a letter. Ethel sighed heavily and said that this was not true at all and that she missed her family very much. The princess was irritated, looked at her sister, and asked what she was talking about. Ethel said that she missed her family very much. She looked at her sister with disdain and said that she would never understand it. Karen was shocked by her sister's words, but a moment later, a maid entered their room. The maid came closer to the princess and whispered something to her quietly. As she was leaving, the princess told her sister that it was time for her to go because the duke was already waiting for her. A moment later, the young princess was left alone in the room. She was very angry with her sister. The princess was heading to meet the duke, accompanied by her maids. But a moment later she turned around and told her maids not to follow her. The maids looked at the young princess in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. The princess looked closely at the maid and said that she was trying very hard. A moment later she turned around and walked towards him. The maid was surprised and did not understand what was happening. Lost in thought, the young lady headed to the meeting. She was puzzled and did not know what his intentions were. In fact, the shame of the family, an illegitimate child, a servant's child. These words no longer meant anything to him. He had been called that since his birth, like a madman. He swung his sword. It was the only thing he was good at. But he was still bullied and beaten. He was always laughed at because he was a nobody. He was considered a slave and lived like the last of the lowly. And then he was sold to the palace for a high price and began to serve as the king's knight. Then he was very lucky that he began to teach the prince the art of the sword. One fine day, he was dining with the princess and the prince. The young men looked at the boy with puzzlement as he greedily devoured his food. The princess said, in surprise, that he ate like an animal, and it seemed that blood could not be deceived. She said that his name sounded pathetic, and he looked more like a mongrel. At that time, he was not offended. He knew that if there is a person whom everyone loves for no reason, then, as a rule, there must be someone whom everyone hates for no reason. But gradually this all crossed the line. In one of the training fights, he accidentally injured the prince. The princess was worried. She asked her brother if he was okay. The princess screamed furiously at the guards to grab Clyde because he wanted to kill her brother. With the speed of lightning, the knights ran up to the boy and grabbed him. They tied his hands very quickly. The Princess of Cheese screamed with rage that they should execute the guy right now. The young man sighed heavily and smiled. Now he understood that everything would end. But a moment later, he was taken aback because he saw the princess in front of him. She blocked him with her body and told her brother that the young man could not be killed. She looked intently at her brother and asked him to have mercy and not touch the young man. Clyde, in turn, felt a previously unfamiliar feeling. Karen lashed out at her sister in anger and asked if she hadn't seen what the young man had done to their brother's hand. She was puzzled because sister was defending the ungrateful scum. Karen looked at her brother and hurriedly shouted that they needed to quickly call the advisor and find out who was behind this, but until then, they should just tie up the young man so that he would not go anywhere. Ethel looked at her family and said that she would tie him up herself because they didn't need to waste their time on something like that. Karen was taken aback as she did not expect to hear something like that. Ethel looked at her brother intently and begged him to spare the young man, for he had simply missed, and it was obvious to everyone. She screamed that he had not done it on purpose. The young man looked at the princess in surprise, because he did not expect to hear something like this. He was surprised because now he understood that she made him feel warm. The prince looked closely at the young man and said that he must explain his actions himself. Everything was as usual, and they were fighting among themselves. The young princess stood at a distance and watched them closely. Clyde was distracted and looked closely at the princess. Unfortunately, he was distracted at the most inopportune moment and came to his senses when he noticed the sword at his throat. With lightning speed, he struck Hell with the sword. He defended himself, but thereby wounded the prince. The young man froze in shock when he saw the prince's wounded hand. A moment later, he shouted that he was looking at the princess. Karen looked at him with a radiant smile and asked if he was really looking at her. The boy shouted that it was not so, but Ethel told her sister that it was indeed so. She looked closely at her sister and said that the young man was captivated by her beauty and for this reason, he was distracted, and because of this, he accidentally touched his brother's hand. The princess looked at the young people with a grin and said that it seemed to be a very good reason. She looked at her brother intently and asked what they would do. She asked if they could turn a blind eye to this and let the young man go. The prince sighed heavily and told his sister that that was exactly what they would do forever. If he wanted to kill him, there would be poison on the tip of the sword. Ethel glanced sideways at the young man, and with lightning speed, turning around, I remember huddling behind her family. He understood perfectly well that on that day she became his only star. While waiting for the princess to arrive, he couldn't get her out of his head. He remembered the young lady whom he could not take his eyes off, as she looked very much like a princess. When he looked at the young lady, his heart beat like crazy, and he lost his mind. His heart was still pounding even after the princess returned. For this reason, he was very eager to meet the princess. A moment later, he was informed that the princess had come for the meeting. The young princess, in turn, froze in front of the door. She remembered what happened 10 years ago, walking for her relatives. She froze in place and shuddered when the young man called her. She turned and looked at him intently, and also asked him not to call her by her title in future, but to simply address her by her first name. The young man looked at her in bewilderment. She sighed heavily and said that such treatment was too much for her. She looked at him intently and said that she was just a decoy who was supposed to protect the real princess. She sighed heavily and said that everything was correct and that it should be this way because she was not capable of anything. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was saying that. The young princess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at the young princess with a smile and said that she was simply wonderful. She froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young man said with a smile that this was more than enough, and therefore she did not need to be sad at all. The young princess looked at him with tears in her eyes, as he was the first one who began to appreciate her. She stared at the closed door as she understood that he was also a hero who restored the imperial regime. The man looked at the princess intently and asked if she wished to come in. She sighed heavily and said that she did. A moment later, the man opened the door for her and introduced her. The young lady walked slowly into the living room and saw the Duke. The Duke froze in shock. He was very excited. She looked closely at the young man and said that she heard he was looking for her. The Duke sighed heavily. But a moment later, he rushed towards the princess with lightning speed. She froze in surprise. The Duke quickly hugged the young lady. The princess was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked sideways at the Duke, in surprise, not knowing what to do. But a moment later, she realized that the Duke was crying on her chest. The Duke wept and trembled, embracing the young princess. He did not stop calling her by different names. 6 years ago, a young man nicknamed the Monster first appeared. The bloodthirsty monster won a crushing victory over the nobles, becoming a hero. God ordered him to protect the imperial family. The debate about whether this was really so continued to this day. She understood perfectly well that he became a hope for the slaves and oppressed. For this reason, he was awarded the title of People's Hero. She knew that he had restored the palace and even brought her to the palace. She always wondered who her enemy was. Now she realized that it was her valiant duckling. Patting the young man on the back, she asked him to calm down and not cry anymore. She was puzzled and afraid of the young man because he knew Stella and Ethel, and for this reason, he could tell the emperor everything. But she was sincerely glad to see him, because he was the only one who had been with her since her childhood. Now she understood perfectly well that he had not forgotten her and had found her again. The maid looked closely at the empress and said that the Duke had met with the princess and that they were both now in their living room. The maid looked closely at the empress and called her. The empress sighed heavily and told the maid that she had a very strange dream yesterday. She thought about it and remembered how they left, leaving young Stella behind. And she remembered the glassy eyes of her child. The girl sat on the ground in despair and cried. The Empress woke up in horror from a long nightmare. She sighed heavily and said that she had dreamed of the day when her daughter left. The Empress thought about it because she knew that she had not had such a thing for a long time. The maid sighed heavily and said that this could be because they had not seen her for a long time. The maid told her mistress that she did not need to worry at all, since the princess had returned again. They had now earned the favor of heaven, and soon it would spread throughout the palace. She said that the imperial family treasured the princess so much that they had given her a personal secret palace for her safety. The Empress sighed heavily and said that everything was true, but she still could not believe everything that was happening. She was puzzled because she knew that she had abandoned her daughter, hoping that she would die immediately. She knew that from the very beginning, there was no separate palace to protect her. She understood that if this truth came out, everyone would hate her. She understood perfectly well that a normal mother would not abandon her child in order to save herself. She was puzzled because she understood that she would be cursed for the rest of her life. Trembling with fear, she said that she could not stand such a thing. The maid looked intently at the Empress and called her. The maid sighed heavily and, looking at the Empress, said that after a long time, she met her beloved daughter, and perhaps that is why she is now very emotionally tense. The maid said that all the workers know very well that she hid the youngest princess in a separate palace only in order to protect her. The Empress looked closely at the maid and said that everything was correct. She understood perfectly well that now everyone thought exactly that way. A moment later, the Empress's expression changed, and she looked at the maid with a grin. She smiled and said that she would take care of her daughter and give her true motherly love. She said about her maid that they needed to go to the living room quickly. She was very serious because she knew she had to protect her daughter from the monster. Some time later, the young princess and the Duke sat quietly drinking tea. The Duke looked at her intently, as if he wanted to say something, but he hesitated and drooped as he saw the expression on her face. A moment later, he asked if she still played the piano. She smiled and said that this instrument in his house was a common thing, even for a person not from a noble family. She sighed heavily and looked away from him, knowing that he could soon burn a hole in her. She thought that when they met again, they would have a lot to talk about, but now she didn't even know where to start. The Duke looked closely at the young princess and exhaled with a smile. He smiled and said that there was a piano in his mansion. She asked in surprise if he played too. He smiled tenderly and said that he had absolutely no talent for it, and it belonged to someone dear to him. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked who the piano belonged to. He looked away from her. She looked at the Duke in surprise, as he did not answer her, but she still wondered who the piano belonged to. She sighed heavily and timidly said that she had heard he wanted to marry her. The Duke was taken aback and choked. The young lady looked at her companion with alarm and asked if he was all right. He apologized and accepted her handkerchief. The Duke was a little embarrassed by her words, but a moment later he looked at her intently, and rising came closer to her. The Duke said that he had already received the blessing of her parents, but unfortunately had not yet received her consent. A moment later he took the ring out of his pocket and knelt before her. The princess froze in surprise. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that he had been waiting for this day for a very long time. Looking intently at the princess, he asked if she would accept the given engagement ring. He asked the princess if she would allow him to become her personal knight. The young lady stood frozen in shock, not knowing what to answer. She saw that he was trembling, holding the ring in his hand. The young lady slowly reached for the ring. But suddenly, unexpectedly for them, the Empress entered the room and angrily called her daughter. The Empress was shocked, as she did not expect to see something like this. The Duke put the ring in his pocket and sighed heavily. The Empress looked intently at the Duke and said that 10 years had already passed. The Duke did not answer her. She looked at the Duke intently and said that they had been apart for a very long time, and now he wanted to take the young princess away from her again. She looked at the Duke intently and asked what she, the poor mother, should do then. The princess was shocked as she saw that the Empress now wanted to become an exemplary mother. The Empress looked at the Duke intently and told him to think it over carefully, as their daughter would miss her family. The Empress screamed that the young princess should at least spend a little time with her mother and father. The Empress was very afraid that her daughter would be taken away from them. Ethel, with the speed of lightning, stood between them, and shielding the Duke with her body, said that she herself wanted to leave with him. The Empress was shocked. She shouted, "Hey!" called her daughter. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that this would not be the worst option. She understood perfectly well that she could no longer become Ethel. She understood that even if the Duke separated her from her family, he was still much better than those who abandoned their child. She looked at the Empress intently and asked her if she really didn't understand. The princess said that she came to the palace because she was tired of being constantly followed. She looked at her mother intently and said that they had reported her missing before, but this had never happened. The Empress hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She looked at the Empress intently and said that they themselves had abandoned her. The Duke froze in shock, and the princess in turn looked menacingly at the Empress. The Empress rushed to her daughter and, taking her hands, said that she was very sorry. The young lady sighed heavily. She was surprised, and she was very scared because her mother's hands were warm and a little rough. Gritting her teeth in rage, she said that the Empress had no need to apologize at all. The Empress looked at her daughter with puzzlement and called her. The young lady, in turn, was very much afraid that she might forgive them. She pushed her mother away and said that it was too late and she no longer needed their apologies. Looking at the Empress, she said that if she was truly sorry, then she should let her go, because by leaving her alone, they should be prepared to bear the punishment for the sin they had committed. The young lady turned and looked intently at the Duke, and with the speed of lightning she seized his hand. As she left, she dragged the Duke along with her. She said angrily that they should go somewhere where they could calmly return to their interrupted conversation. Empress Kay stared after them, unable to utter a word. After some time, they came to the room of the young princess. The Duke looked closely at her hand because she was still holding his hand. Ethel looked closely at the Duke and said that in her room they could talk normally, but a moment later she heard a terrible noise and crash. The Emperor looked at the maid with fury. He did not understand how she dared to lie to him. The maid burst into tears. She told the Emperor that the princess looked very sad, and when she wrote the letter, and she simply did not dare to bring it to him. Bursting into tears, she begged for mercy. The Emperor shouted furiously that he did not need her excuses, and for this she would pay with her life. But a moment later the young lady entered the room with their Duke. Ethel looked intently at her father and called him. He looked at his daughter in surprise and called her. The young princess came closer to the Emperor and said that he was holding her letter in his hands. She looked him straight in the eye and asked him to return the letter. With the speed of lightning, the Emperor approached his daughter and gave her the letter. She sighed heavily and said with a gentle smile that she was always being watched. She knew that she would have to sit humbly in her room. She told her father that she would be useful as long as she was in the palace. The princess looked at the Emperor intently and said that from this letter onwards, he should not pay attention to her. The Emperor looked at her with fury and said that this was simply impossible. He looked closely at his daughter and said that she would soon have to appear before the people as their princess, and he would like to grant her the title of Count. He looked at his daughter with surprise and excitement and asked where she came from. He wanted to know what kind of pain she had experienced. The princess looked at her father and said that it was not so, because he must want to know how she had to fall without looking. But when she was able to return the stars, it seemed even more suspicious to him. She looked at him intently and said that she had never had such powers and had always been useless. The Emperor looked at her with cold fury. A moment later, he came closer to her and, squeezing her shoulders, called out. She looked at him intently and, pushing his hand away, said whether she was real or not. She still did not understand why he was interested in this. The young lady looked at her father with a smirk and asked if it was that important. For a moment there was dead silence in the young lady's room. The emperor shouted in rage that she was the second princess of the empire, and he was her father. He asked in anger how he could harm her. He looked intently at his daughter and shouted that by his power she would be granted the most luxurious tiara. The young princess did not listen to him, and with a grin asked who had granted him this power. The emperor called his daughter in anger, but the young princess, in a calm manner, said that he should leave her alone and let the poor servant go. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really hated him that much. He asked if she really couldn't stand him that much that she would agree to marry a duke she had only seen a few times. The emperor looked closely at his daughter and asked if her hatred for her family was so strong that she was ready to leave them for the stranger. The young princess sighed heavily as she saw that the emperor was now asking if she hated them. As she left, she sighed heavily and told her father that she did not know what answer he expected from her. She asked the emperor to leave. A moment later she approached the duke and, frozen in place, trembled. She looked intently at the duke, but after a few seconds she walked past him. The emperor looked at the duke intently and ordered him to bring the princess to him. The young lady froze in place after her father's words. The princess looked at the duke intently and with surprise. She was puzzled and afraid of him. The duke, in turn, looked intently at the princess and with the speed of lightning hurried to her. She was shocked and looked at him with tears in her eyes. The princess reproached herself for having forgotten who he was. She was shocked because she understood that he was now also on the side of the emperor. He looked intently at the princess and stretched out his hands towards her. But a moment later, the duke grabbed the princess in his arms and looked at her intently. She froze in surprise. He looked at her intently and calmly asked her not to cry anymore. The princess looked at him in bewilderment but did not answer. The emperor looked at the duke intently and said with a smile that he had done the right thing. A moment later, the emperor asked the duke to put the young lady on the sofa, for they had much to talk about. But the duke did not listen to the emperor. With the speed of lightning, he turned around and walked towards the exit. The emperor was furious. He shouted and called the duke because he did not understand where he was going. With lightning speed, the duke carried the young princess to the exit, Peter shouting after the duke. The young man looked at the duke with excitement and said that glory was very difficult to achieve, but easy to lose. The duke did not answer the young man. Peter shouted to the duke that he should still think everything over carefully because he was not yet married to the princess. Therefore, the princess still belonged to her father, the emperor. The young man was agitated. He shouted at the duke that he could not just take her away. The duke looked at his assistant with fury, as he did not like his words. Holding back his anger, the duke said that the princess was not anyone's property and could not belong to anyone. The young man was taken aback because he saw that the duke was furious. A moment later, he asked the duke for forgiveness and asked him to be patient. The duke looked at his assistant with cold fury and said that he was patient because he was still alive. He thought for a moment as he remembered the princess screaming that they had all abandoned her. He sighed heavily as he realized that he had been very stupid. He was puzzled and wondered how he could provide her with a peaceful life. The duke looked at the young man intently and said that he had forgiven him many times and spared his life. He looked at Peter with cold fury and said that it was he who told the first princess about Ethel. Peter froze in shock, his voice shaking. He said that he did it for the Hill family. The duke looked at the young man with cold fury and said that he must go away and never show his face again. He said that he had already found the one he had been looking for so long and no longer needed the annoying man from the palace. The young man looked at the duke with puzzlement and said that he could not fire him because the emperor himself had hired him to serve him. The duke looked at him with fury and said that if he said another word, he would send him back to where he belonged. The young man was taken aback and froze in place. because he was very afraid of the Duke. The young princess flew into her father's office with lightning speed. She was excited and asked her father if he had heard that the Duke was carrying Stella in his arms down the corridor. The princess screamed furiously at her father that Stella had not yet married him. She did not understand how her sister could do such a thing. The emperor's son looked at his daughter with cold fury and told her that she had previously said that she had found her sister on the street. The young princess looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. With lightning speed, the emperor rose from his chair and with cold fury asked his daughter where exactly she had found her sister. The young princess hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She was very worried and afraid of her father. She timidly said that she did not know the name. The emperor approached his daughter with lightning speed and asked with cold fury if this was true. She could not utter a word because she was afraid of him. He said with fury and contempt that she must leave because he did not want to see her anymore. The young princess was taken aback because she had not expected anything like this from her father. The emperor was furious. He knew that neither the sun nor the moon could stop the rebellion and restore the power of the imperial family. The only thing that could help was the star. He was well aware that he needed to get his child back, no matter what it cost him. The princess and the duke walked slowly towards the carriage. The empress blocked their way and told her daughter that she could not let her leave so easily. The young lady looked back and saw that they were surrounded by imperial knights. The empress looked at the duke with excitement and said that this was her request, not as an empress but as a mother. She said that 10 years had passed all this time. They had missed their daughter very much. The empress told the duke that now her daughter had returned, and she should receive everything that was due to her as a princess. The empress looked at her daughter closely and said that she was certainly a bad mother, but she still wanted her daughter to listen to her before she left. The young princess looked at her mother intently, wondering if it was a threat or a plea. She understood that if her mother was making a threat, then it was in her nature, but if it was a plea, then it was just ridiculous. She understood perfectly well that the child who begged her parents not to abandon her was now just a soulless shell. The duke looked intently at the young princess. He did not know what to do and understood perfectly well that it was she who should decide everything. Ethel, looking at the empress, asked her to step aside and not interfere with them. The duke remembered how the young princess had told him that the imperial family would not let her go so easily. Ethel sighed heavily and told the duke that perhaps they could find a reason to keep her. Ethel looked at the duke intently and said that even if they had made a promise to him long ago, they would not keep it. The duke looked around and stared at the knights. The knights present were taken aback as they saw his menacing gaze. The duke looked at the young princess and asked if he should deal with his knights. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at the princess intently and said softly that if she wished he would get rid of them all. She looked at the duke in surprise and asked if he really wanted to deal with everyone. He smiled softly and said that it was true. A moment later they turned around because they saw the emperor. The emperor said that in 6 months the wedding would take place. The young lady turned to the duke with lightning speed and thanked him, but she also said that he should not interfere. The duke looked at her in surprise. He wanted to object. Ethel, looking at the duke, said that it was entirely her business and that she must sort it out herself. A moment later, she slowly walked up to the emperor and looked at him intently. The emperor looked at his dear daughter with a smile. He sighed heavily and with an innocent smile said that he should not have asked unnecessary questions at all. He said that if she wanted, then he would leave her alone. The princess looked intently at her father but said nothing. He came closer to her and slowly put his hand on her shoulder. The emperor said with a sly smile that she herself had said that she would be useful to him. He said that everything would be as she wanted. He said with a gentle smile that she could stay in the palace. The duke, in turn, looked at the emperor with cold fury. He was burning with rage, but he could do nothing about it. The princess looked at the emperor intently because she knew that he wanted her to become a plaything. to raise the status of the imperial family. He wanted her to pay for the sins of her parents, who abandoned their child. She was furious because she knew that they did not even realize how much pain their words caused her. She looked at the emperor intently, because she knew that she could make a decision without a moment's hesitation. She pushed his hand away and said that she had one condition. The emperor, overjoyed and smiling, said that she could ask for whatever she wanted. The young princess asked with a grin if she could really ask for anything. He smiled and said that it was exactly like that. She looked at him intently and said that in 6 months, wherever she went, whatever she did, he should not look for her. She understood perfectly well that this game had only one perfect ending. She knew that if she escaped from the palace and was left alone again, she would be as happy as ever. Ethel, looking at her father, said that they should all forget about her because she had never asked for anything else. Some time later, the princess and the duke sat and drank tea in silence. The duke looked closely at the young princess and asked if she really wanted to return to the tavern in 6 months. The young princess looked at the duke with a soft smile. A moment later, she said that unfortunately that was not possible. Ethel, in turn, understood perfectly well that the emperor could not be trusted, so she should not stay in the place where she happily spent her days. She knew that she had to preserve wonderful memories so that those dear to her could also live happily. Ethel sighed and said that sometimes the brightest colors in their lives were the simplest, and even her abilities for the imperial family. The duke looked at the young princess in surprise and intently, but said nothing. She looked at him with a smile and said that he himself had said earlier that she did not belong to anyone. She said that he himself had said earlier that he needed her consent, not her parents. He sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. She looked at the duke intently and asked if he could keep away from her. Then, the duke froze in shock. He didn't expect to hear anything like that. A moment later, he pulled himself together and said that in return, he needed to see her at least once a week. She was surprised, as she had not expected such a thing. He looked at her intently, and with pity in his eyes, asked her to give him at least this opportunity. She sighed heavily and looked away from him as she thought about his request. He looked at her intently and said that as long as she found him useful, he would like to ask her permission to be near her. The young princess, in turn, really wanted to ask him about something. She knew that he had been by her side throughout her childhood, but she did not understand why he had fought so much for the imperial family. She was puzzled because she did not know why he began to serve them. The young lady was puzzled, for she knew that the problem lay in her hurt feelings. Some time later, the princess met the viscount. The viscount looked at the princess intently and asked with a smile why she was so angry. She sighed heavily and said that she was told that she was useless. The young princess was furious, as it was the first time in her long life that she had heard such words. Jason looked at the princess with a smirk and asked how she was feeling now. She looked at him with fury and asked if he really thought she'd come to him for psychological consultation. He smiled and said that he knew it wasn't true, but still her sister had heard it all her life. The princess looked at him with a smile and said that it seemed to be true, and he was on her sister's side. Jason smirked at the princess as he sipped his wine. He said he was just on the side of his special client. Karen looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Jason asked the princess with a grin if she had heard anything about the Stella Idolante Foundation. A moment later, he handed her the documents, and the princess began to read them carefully. She was shocked by what she read. The emperor looked at the young man with anger and asked if the princess had really given the money to the aristocrats. The young man said that this was exactly how it was, and after the foundation was founded, the princess gave the money to everyone who lost at the casino. The young man was surprised and asked the emperor where she got so much money. The emperor was furious. He wondered if she had spent money from the state treasury on the aristocrats. He was angry and wondered if she had bribed them all. A moment later, he burst into hysterical laughter as he realized that this cheap trick had given her confidence. He looked at the young man closely and asked who else knew about this. The young man bowed and told the emperor that not many people knew about this situation at the moment, but rumors spread quickly. The emperor looked at the young man with cold fury and anger and asked if this was verified information. Peter looked intently at the emperor and informed him that everything had been checked and was correct, and there could be no mistake. The young man slowly left the emperor's office, and on the way out, he ran into the princess. The young princess thanked him for his trust with a radiant smile. Peter bowed low to the princess and said that rumors had already spread among the nobles. He also thanked the princess for her wisdom and for bringing him up to date. The princess sighed heavily and said that her sister, upon returning to the palace, had spent a huge sum of money on the aristocrats, and such impudence was driving her crazy. Karen said that her sister was going to leave the palace in 6 months, and no one knew what would happen to the sky of the empire after she left. The young man sighed heavily and looked away from the princess. After a short pause, he asked the princess what she was going to do about it. The princess said with a smile that she should teach a good lesson to her sister, since she is the first princess, and her elder sister Karen said with a smile that she will show her sister that she should make a choice according to her responsibilities. She said with a grin that she was doing all this for the sake of the country and the imperial family. The young man bowed low to the princess and praised her. The next day, the maid informed the young princess that the duke had come to see her. The princess was surprised because he came to her again. A moment later, they were sitting and drinking tea. She looked at the duke intently and said that she thought they had agreed to meet weekly on Mondays. The duke sighed heavily and said that it was correct. The princess looked at him intently and said that yesterday and the day before yesterday and even today is not Monday, but they met. He looked at her pitifully and asked if she really didn't want to see him. She sighed heavily and looked away from him because she knew the problem was that she really wanted to see him. Ethel looked at Clyde and asked when he was returning north. He sighed heavily and said that he wanted to take someone with him. The duke slowly extended his hand to the young princess. Taking her hand, he looked at her intently and said that, until she became his, he would not go anywhere. The young lady froze in place in embarrassment. For some time, he tenderly touched her small hand. The young lady was very embarrassed by such behavior of the duke. She took her hand back, embarrassed, but quick, and the duke froze in place for a moment. Ethel looked at the duke, embarrassed and timid, and asked which way was north. Clyde said with a smile that the north was a wonderful place. It was called the Sacred Land due to its wealth of natural resources. Looking at the duke, the princess said that people also survive there because there are a lot of monsters in the north. She understood perfectly well that the duke was sent to a distant, cold, and cruel place, and it was all because of the emperor's cowardice. The emperor was afraid that the young man could pose a threat to the imperial power. She looked at the duke intently and asked if he had ever asked for a reward. She said that the East is the land of artists and performers, and they said that spring there is the most beautiful due to the many flowers, and in the south there is a very hot summer and the most fastidious people, and for this reason it was considered the best place for rest. She knew very well that the West was the place where the scientific communities gathered, where debates never ceased, and that this land was also the most beautiful in autumn. The princess looked at the duke with puzzlement and said that he had fought bravely, and now he had been given the northern territories. He smiled and asked the princess if she didn't like the cold. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so. The duke smiled and thoughtfully said that the north is a very good place, and the people there are very calm. And since the climate there is cold, the temperament of the people is also very restrained. The young lady looked at the duke with a smile, because she realized that he loved the north very much. She smiled and said that everything was true, and it was very nice there. Some time later, their meeting ended, and the young lady slowly escorted the duke to the carriage. Looking at his companion, the duke asked if she would like to visit the northern territories sometime. She smiled and said that it would be very good. Clyde looked at the princess with a tender smile as he was pleased with her answer. A moment later he was as fast as lightning approaching her face. The princess froze in place. He quietly whispered something in her ear. The young princess was confused by his words and jumped away from the duke with lightning speed. But the young man in turn looked at her with a gentle smile, as he was amused by her reaction. Some time later, she looked after the duke with a fixed and embarrassed expression. Ethel was very much embarrassed, for she remembered his words, which he had told her a moment ago. He had quietly whispered in her ear that whenever she set foot on the northern lands, he would always be taller than her. She was puzzled, for she knew that he could have simply told her. Looking at her, Ethel did not at all understand why he needed to embarrass her so. Walking back to her place, she wondered if he would come tomorrow. The next day, the young lady stood frozen in surprise. She looked at the man intently and asked if he was here again. The man sighed heavily and said that it was true. Some time later, the young princess did meet the duke, but she also met one man on her way. The duke and the princess looked at the young man in bewilderment. The man with a radiant smile said that his name was Jean Basil, and he had come to sew an outfit personally for the princess. He took the princess's hand with a smile and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her. A moment later, he kissed her hand. The duke looked at the man with fury. A moment later, with lightning speed, he pushed the man away from the princess. The princess froze in surprise. The duke looked at the princess intently and asked if she had an appointment today. Ethel told the duke that she did not. Ethel looked at the maid and said that she had not invited the young man to the meeting. The maid looked at her in surprise. A moment later, Karen looked at her sister with a smile and called her name. Karen looked at her sister with a smirk and said that, as a princess, she must express her love for the people and manage the state treasury wisely. She looked at her sister intently and said that the dress from Jean was very expensive. Looking at her sister, she told her to stop giving money to aristocrats and throwing it away. The empress looked at her daughter in bewilderment and asked if Stella was really giving money to aristocrats. She asked her daughter what she was talking about. Ethel looked at her sister with a smirk. Karen, mother, what can she ask her daughter what is being discussed? Karen looked at her father closely and said that he was probably wondering too. The princess looked at her sister and said with a grin that she had spent the check she had borrowed from her parents on something very interesting. Ethel, she looked at everyone present but said nothing. The emperor walked up to his daughter with lightning speed and looked at her with fury. Clyde, with lightning speed, blocked the princess with his body and told the emperor that he took full responsibility. Ethel looked at her fiancé in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. Karen glared at her sister, but a moment later she ran up to her. She grabbed her hand with lightning speed and pulled her closer to her parents. The duke was in shock, but unfortunately, he could not do anything. The princess looked at her sister with a smirk and told her to stop playing such games already. And she also asked if Stella really didn't want to tell her parents where she put the money. Ethel looked at her sister with fury, but said nothing. The young princess was furious because she understood that her sister had gathered the entire imperial family in a huge hall. She understood that her sister had tried hard to lure everyone to her side. Karen looked at her sister with a fierce grin and said that she could tell everyone about her spending. Ethel looked at her sister in surprise. She did not understand why she was acting this way because she herself said that she would disappear from the palace in 6 months. A moment later, she pushed her sister away and took her river. She looked at everyone present and informed them that she had spent exactly 10 billion gold. Everyone present was shocked by her statement. A moment later, she looked at everyone in the room and informed them that today she would return everything back to the last coin. Karen looked at her sister with a smirk. She looked at everyone present with a mocking look and said that for this reason, a person needs education. The princess said that her sister had lived on the street among ordinary people for a very long time. She said that for her, 1 billion or 10 billion were just numbers. She looked at her sister with disdain and said that such fabulous sums did not grow on trees. Ethel interrupted her sister before she could finish speaking. She looked at her sister with a smirk and asked who at the moment besides Evandor's could be called the richest man in the empire. Karen looked at her sister with fury and asked her if she really thought she was a princess and could interrupt her. She was furious and shouted that her sister was just an impudent woman. Ethel came up to her sister with the speed of lightning and said with cold fury that she had asked her a question. The young lady backed away, not expecting such force from her sister. A moment later, the maid approached the princess and quietly whispered something in her ear. The princess looked at everyone present with a grin. Karen looked at her sister with a smile and told her that the richest person could be considered the duke, who was standing next to her, because if you count the income from the powerful army, plus the cost of the resources of the north, he was a rich man. Ethel looked at her sister with a smile and said that unfortunately she was thinking incorrectly. Karen sighed heavily and said that she had completely forgotten about Angelica Lisa. She had received a huge inheritance. Ethel looked at her sister with a smirk and said that 2 trillion wasn't even close. The young princess looked at her sister in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Ethel looked at everyone present with a radiant smile and said that, at the moment, the wealth of the richest man is 45 trillion, and every year he receives 20% of the profit from the largest diamond mines of the empire. Karen looked at her sister puzzled and asked who she was talking about. Karen looked at her sister with excitement. She was in shock. She didn't understand how this was possible. The princess looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that there is one famous saying. She looked at everyone present and said that these diamond mines now belong to her. She told everyone with a satisfied smile that she had won the bet with Jason Evandor's. She looked sideways and mockingly at her sister and asked if a person really needed education. She came closer to her sister and said with a grin that unfortunately she had no education, but she was much better than her, who had received the best imperial education all her life. She asked her sister with a grin what she had been taught anyway. A moment later, Ethel, her head held high, was leaving the imperial palace with Clyde. The Duke walked slowly and silently next to the princess, looking sideways at her. He remembered how the emperor angrily asked his daughter what stakes they were talking about. Ethel looked at her father with a look of disdain and told him that she had placed a bet that her parents would abandon her forever. After a short pause, looking at the emperor, Ethel said that everyone was betting on whether Stella Idolante could return the stars to the sky. Clyde looked at the princess intently. He was puzzled and did not know since when she said such hurtful words with a calm look. The princess sighed heavily and told her companion that he did not need to console her at all. A moment later, she said goodbye to him with a smile. The Duke came closer to her and tenderly kissed her hand. He smiled and said goodbye to her until the next time she smiled tenderly and asked if he was going to come tomorrow. He looked at her with a gentle smile, but did not answer. A moment later, the Duke was already sitting in the carriage and was about to leave. The young princess looked in surprise at the emperor who was running towards her. He was furious and shouted at his daughter that they had a lot to talk about. The princess sighed heavily, as she was not at all she intended to talk to him. With lightning speed, she turned and ran to the Duke, asking for forgiveness. She climbed into his carriage. The Duke was taken aback as he did not expect such a thing. He looked at the princess in bewilderment, but unfortunately, he didn't have time to say anything. The princess smiled and asked if it was time for them to go. The emperor ran after the carriage and shouted for his daughter to stop. The emperor looked at his subordinates with fury and asked what they were worth. He wanted them to catch up with the carriage immediately. The men told the emperor that it was too late and the carriage had left. The emperor shouted at them with his fury. At the same time, the viscount was sitting over documents. A moment later, an assistant entered his office. The man smiled and said, "More and more people are starting to take an interest in the young princess's fund." The man looked at his master intently and said that information was limited and money was flowing in, and this was all very much attracting people's attention. He looked at the gentleman intently and said that everyone was especially interested in who the young lady really was. The Viscount said with a smile that this was how it should be. He thought for a moment and sighed heavily and said that aristocrats love gossip very much because their life is very boring. Jason, for his part, knew perfectly well that when their interest was at its peak, they would introduce her to the highest society in order to shock them as much as possible. He knew perfectly well that they would be shocked when they found out that everyone's favorite princess turned out to be a special client of the Evandor's family. Jason smirked and told his assistant that power does not appear out of nowhere. It comes when the people are interested in it. And in this case, the princess is the ideal form of power. The man looked at his master and asked him with a smile if he had really guessed everything Jason said, with a smile that it was exactly like that, and that he was not just sharing the percentage of income, because he knew that giving money away for nothing was the greatest stupidity in the world. He smiled and said that he would definitely create a product that people would want to buy as soon as possible. And for this reason, he would be respected even after his death. He said with a grin that he would definitely create the Evandor's empire. The man bowed to his master and said that he was thinking very correctly. He said that he would immediately prepare gifts for the Princess Jason, agreed with his assistant, but he also said that the gifts should be special. The assistant to wrap them in gold paper. A moment later, the man told his master that he didn't know if that was true and didn't know if he should even say such a thing. He looked at the gentleman intently and timidly said that there were rumors that the Duke had captured the young princess. Jason looked at his assistant in surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. Sometime later, the young princess and the Duke were at sea. She looked at the beautiful sea and said with a smile that it was beautiful. The Duke looked at her with a gaze and agreed with a smile. She smiled and said that she often came to this place when she lived as a simple girl. She said with a smile that, unfortunately, she did not think that she would ever be able to return. The Duke looked at her intently but did not answer. Looking at the princess, he realized that she clearly felt much more comfortable here than in the palace. He understood perfectly well that his blind melancholy would not erase this smile from her face. A moment later, he looked at the princess in bewilderment as he saw that she was taking off her shoes. She looked at the Duke with a smile and informed him that in this place, it was absolutely necessary to walk barefoot. Clyde looked closely at the princess as he saw that she was charming. He froze for a moment as he realized that he wanted to touch her. He wanted to squeeze her in his arms. Ethel looked at the Duke and said with a smile that he should not tell anyone about this place because it was very important to her. The Duke was in shock. He understood that if he touched her and hugged her now, she would certainly consider him a terrible monster. She smiled and, looking at the Duke, asked if he would tell anyone about this. The Duke froze in place, staring at her radiant smile. A moment later, he nodded his head in response. A few minutes later, the young lady was walking barefoot along the beach, humming a cheerful song under her breath. Some time later, the emperor summoned the man to an audience. He looked at the man excitedly and asked if it was true that his daughter had 45 trillion. The man looked at the emperor intently and said that everything was correct and the money was kept in the Evandor's family bank. He also said that the dividends and interest she received were also in the billions. The emperor looked at the man with a joyful smile. The emperor was shocked because he understood that his daughter had become rich thanks to her own efforts. He considered her simply incomparable. He understood perfectly well that the amount of money this person had at his disposal had already put him in an awkward position more than once or twice. The emperor said with a smile that this was very commendable. The man looked at the emperor intently and said that this was not all because a huge number of letters were coming from people wishing to invest in the young princess's fund. and the aristocracy were at the forefront of Her Highness's followers. The emperor said with joy that his daughter had already won the hearts of the nobility. He was glad that he had such a beautiful daughter. The emperor looked at the empress with bewilderment and asked why she was not happy about such wonderful news. He said with a radiant smile that their daughter had become very successful. The empress looked closely at her husband and said that unfortunately she was not sure whether this was good news. The emperor looked at his wife in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The empress said that there were people who were very dear to her, and she considered them her family, and now she had a lot of money. She said that the time when she would no longer need them could come sooner than they thought. The empress looked at her husband with alarm and asked if they should find the people who raised her. She said they needed to ask people how she lived and what she loved. The emperor looked at his wife with anger and called her. He asked with cold anger if she had forgotten what he had said that day. He said that she should forget about it. He looked at his wife with anger and shouted that she should stop ruining everything already. The empress looked at her husband with her rage and shouted that she had given birth to Stella. But if she herself said that she did not consider her a mother, then this could ruin everything. She looked intently at her husband and asked what people would think then. She shouted to her husband that now there was nothing more important than winning her favor. The emperor looked at his wife with a grin and said that their daughter was acting this way because she was truly a bad mother. The empress looked at the emperor with fury. The emperor was furious. He shouted at his wife that the past could not be corrected, and she did not need to fill her head with unnecessary things. She was furious and shouted that he repeated this every time. The empress asked her husband what he had done to be a good father to her. They continued to argue fiercely for some time. The man wanted to stop them, but he realized that it was useless. At the same time, the young princess stood at the door and heard their entire conversation. But a moment later she turned around and walked into her room. She was furious as she was tired of such scandals. The princess understood perfectly well that nothing had changed over time. She was furious because she understood that now, as well as many years ago, her parents were arguing for the same reason. She remembered how the emperor, with a gentle smile, said that he was very glad that they had her because she was very kind and sweet. Karen, with a radiant smile, told her father that she would certainly behave well. She was very happy to hear praise from him, but now she was puzzled and did not understand what she had done to deserve such treatment from her father. After a long walk, the Duke noticed that the young lady was very tired and fell asleep on the shore. He caught her not letting her fall. After a short sleep, the young lady looked in surprise at the Duke, who was sitting next to her. She saw that he was a little embarrassed. A moment later their eyes met, and they stared at each other for several minutes, but neither made the first move. The Duke asked the young lady, embarrassed, if she was awake yet. She embarrassedly informed him that that was exactly it. A moment later, the Duke informed the princess that they should leave before it got dark. He looked at her intently and told her that she should hold on to his shoulder so as not to fall. She looked at her fiancé sheepishly and said that there was no need for that. He smiled a pleasant smile and said that he would like that. A moment later, he elegantly helped her with her shoes. The Duke looked closely at the princess and informed her that he would take her to the palace. She sighed heavily and, looking away from him, said that unfortunately she had no desire to go back there now. Clyde looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she had escaped and he was her accomplice. The Duke froze in place for a moment. She looked at him intently and with a smile asked him to shelter her. For one night, the Duke froze in shock and looked at the princess with an open mouth, embarrassed. After some time, the Duke and the princess arrived at the Duke's estate. The butler ran up to the Duke with lightning speed. He looked at the Duke intently and greeted him, but a moment later he noticed the young lady. The Duke glanced sideways at the butler and told him to prepare a room for the guest. The butler bowed obediently and said that he would certainly do everything. The young lady walked slowly behind the Duke and looked around his property. She froze for a moment and looked intently at the piano that stood in the center of the hall. A moment later, the young princess ran to the piano with the speed of lightning. She quickly walked up to him and opened the lid. She froze in place in surprise because he was familiar to her. She remembered the day when the young people brought him to the palace. The man looked closely at the young princess and said that unfortunately one key was missing, but overall it was a very good piano. He smiled and said that the princess was sorry to throw it away. A moment later, he stopped himself and said that the princess gave it to her. Ethel asked with a radiant smile if sister had really given her such a luxurious gift. She knew that they wanted to throw the piano away, and it was broken. She understood perfectly well that this was her first gift in life. The young man looked closely at the young princess and said with a smile that she played very well. The princess knew that she was the only one who tried her best and showed it. She stood quietly for a while, staring at the instrument. She sighed heavily and said that it looked like someone had been playing the piano in this house. The Duke looked at the young princess intently and said that this was not really the case. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand at all. The Duke said that there had been no one up to that point. The princess looked at him intently and said that this broken thing was from the palace and must have been very difficult to save. The Duke looked at the princess intently and said that it was not like that at all, because he was the first one to set foot on the ruined palace grounds. She was surprised because she understood that he had managed to carry a large piano out of that chaos. She remembered how they had recently sat and peacefully sipped tea. Then they had had a casual conversation, and the Duke had then mentioned that he had a piano on his estate, and it belonged to someone dear to him. The young princess looked intently at the Duke, as she saw in him the same boy from her distant childhood. She sighed heavily and looked at the Duke intently, as she had the feeling that he was not an imperial swordsman, not a hero of the rebellion, and not a defender of the heavens, but simply her young beloved childhood friend. The Duke looked intently at the princess and asked if she could play something for him. Ethel looked at the Duke in surprise, as she had not expected this, but still a moment later she sat up and began to play music. The Duke looked at the princess with a smile, and his lightning speed, he plunged into the past. Some time later, the princess was walking around the estate. She was surprised because she saw that the entire ceiling was one continuous landscape. She was amazed by such art because she did not know who did it. A moment later, the young princess saw the door to the room she was in. She walked slowly to the door and opened it, but a moment later she froze in place as she saw the Duke. He looked at her closely and said he wanted to know if she liked the room. She looked at him with embarrassment and said with a smile that, of course, she liked everything, and now she didn't even want to leave the estate. He smiled and said that he was very glad that he could please her. Ethel looked at the Duke with embarrassment. A moment later, she looked away from him and said that she had never seen ceilings like these, as landscapes usually depicted ordinary people. The princess looked around the beautiful room with a radiant smile. She said that it was very beautiful and cozy. She looked at the Duke with a smile and told him that she would like to see if there were any interesting places in the corridor. She remembered that when they were looking around the estate, she noticed many perfect places to play hide and seek. She saw a beautiful garden so huge that you could run around in it freely. The young princess said with a smile that as a child, she said every day that she wanted to live in such a place. She looked at the Duke in surprise, wondering if he had remembered all her words from childhood. Clyde looked at her intently and said that he had ordered everything because he too had dreamed of such a house. The young princess looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He slowly walked closer to her and with a gentle smile said that she came to his house before their wedding, and now rumors could start. The young lady looked away from him in embarrassment and said that she knew about it. She looked at the Duke intently and informed him that she would immediately be on the front page of the Daily Velvet, the aristocrat's favorite magazine. He looked at her worriedly and asked if everything would be okay with her. She sighed heavily, and casting her gaze downwards, said that she did not care for them at all. She said that she knew that it would be nice to gain the favor of the aristocracy, but she had no intention of bowing her head to them. A moment later, the young lady touched his chest with tenderness. The Duke shuddered and looked at the princess with embarrassment, because he did not expect such a thing. Ethel ran her hand tenderly over his scars. She sighed heavily and said that, while they had not seen each other, he had managed to get hurt. The editor-in-chief of the newspaper burst into the Viscount's room with lightning speed. The man was excited and shouted to the Viscount that he had an urgent message. Jason looked at the man in surprise and asked if this was such important news. The man shouted that everything was exactly like that. He shouted that Princess Stella spent her night with a stranger. Jason froze in surprise. He was shocked by this news. Some time later, the young princess sat quietly in the room. She remembered the Duke telling her that he wanted her to stay in the best room in the estate. She was pleasantly touched by the fact that he had even given her his room, because it was the most comfortable. Ethel thought that he seemed not to think at all about her sleeping in his bed. Unfortunately, the young princess still had doubts about the Duke. She knew that he was a man far from greed and lust for power. For this reason, he would never have gone north without a special reason. She knew that his supporters, slaves and commoners, were demanding new land plots. For this reason, the Duke took them all with him and headed straight north. He went to the arid lands far from Utopia. She was puzzled because she did not know what force made him make such decisions. At first, the young princess thought that it was all because of affection. She knew that the imperial family had accepted and started providing for him since he was a child. And in order to restore their authority, they even gave him the title of Duke. But however, she was puzzled because she did not understand why he continued to act contrary to the imperial order. She felt like he was showing with his actions that she was more important to him than the emperor. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that the palace was currently in complete chaos. She knew that perhaps tomorrow, her visit to the Duke would become the #1 scandal in all the newspapers. The editor shouted to the Viscount that they had to write about this news right away, because tomorrow everyone would be discussing it, and their shares would certainly rise. The newspaper would sell at the speed of light. Jason sighed heavily and said that they didn't have to do that. The man looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. The man was furious. He shouted that now, in the entire empire, there was not a single person who would not want to know absolutely everything about the princess. He shouted that they simply had to publish an article about the princess spending the night with the Duke. Jason looked at the man with cold fury and asked how much longer he had to listen to boring stories. The man flinched in surprise. He was shocked by his behavior because he expected a different reaction. In a hurry, he asked for forgiveness and said that he had misspoke. Jason sighed heavily and told the man that he had taken up too much of his time. He approached the editor and told him with cold fury that he was getting old and seemed to be lacking inspiration. He asked me if it was time for him to step down as editor-in-chief. The man was shocked because he did not expect this. With the speed of lightning, he bowed and asked for forgiveness. In these lands, also known as the Evander's Empire, the Daily Velvet was a reliable mainstay. The man was very angry and confused because he worked hard to become the editor-in-chief. Jason, with the speed of lightning, walked up to the man and grabbed him by the jacket. He looked at the editor with cold fury and said that he must try very hard. The man was taken aback and trembling with fear. He said that he would do everything in his power. Jason told the editor that he should try, but if he saw even one article about the princess scandal, he would definitely deal with it personally. A moment later, the young man told the editor that he had something he wanted to convey to the imperial family. The man trembled with fear as he looked at the Viscount. Jason looked at the editor with a grin and showed him the letter, telling him that he should give it to the Empress and tell her that it was from the Viscount. Some time later, the Empress and the Princess were sitting and drinking tea. The Empress looked closely at her daughter and asked how she had chewed. Karen smiled and told her mother that everything was fine. The Empress sighed heavily and told her daughter that she was not changing. The young princess shuddered and looked at her mother in surprise, asking if she really wanted to tell her something. The Empress looked coldly at her daughter and told her to stop lying about finding her sister on the street. The young princess backed away, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. The Empress sighed heavily, and looking at her daughter, said that she had no intention of harming that family. She said that she just wanted to thank them and ask about Stella's life and her favorite things. The young princess was furious. She didn't want to lie to her mother at all, but she understood perfectly well that she couldn't afford to miss her sister's only weakness. She looked closely at the Empress, and with an innocent smile, said that she really didn't know anything. The Empress looked at her daughter in bewilderment and asked why she was doing this. The young princess froze, not knowing what to answer. The Empress looked intently at her daughter and said that she was kind and could not act like that. The young lady froze in place, in surprise, but a moment later she told her mother that she was not lying to her at all. The Empress sighed heavily, and looking away from her, said that they had finished their conversation, and she could leave. The young lady slowly carried out her mother's order. She slowly returned to her room, burning with anger and rage. The princess understood perfectly well that she only needed to endure for 6 months. She knew that if she left her sister alone, she would return to where she came from and would not even marry the Duke. A moment later, Karen turned around as she heard someone calling her. The man bowed politely with a smile and greeted the princess. He also introduced himself and told her that he was the best designer in the entire empire. He said that his CL collection was extremely popular with young men and women. The princess looked at the man closely and said that it was true, and she had heard about it. She knew that his outfits were famous for their luxury and abundance of precious stones. For this reason, his brand was preferred by all aristocrats. A moment later, the young princess saw a letter in the man's hands. She asked him what it was. Looking at the princess, the man smiled and said that he was holding an invitation. Jean smiled and said that he had been waiting for the moment to give it to the princess because she inspired him. He asked if she could give the princess the invitation. With lightning speed, the young princess took the letter from him and said with a grin that she would definitely think about his proposal. The man was taken aback and said that everything was wrong because the invitation was intended for her sister. The young princess froze in shock because she did not expect this. She looked angrily at the man and asked what he was talking about. The man looked closely at the young princess and said that of course it was a great honor for him to meet her. He said that saving money was very important. Most likely she was not interested in his clothes. He remembered how the princess herself had spoken of her sister, that as a princess, she must express her love for the people and manage the state treasury wisely, because Jean's clothes were very expensive. The princess turned around with lightning speed and told the man that he was free to go and that she would definitely take the letter to the princess. The man looked after the princess with joy and thanked her. Karen was furious. She knew that she was the thrifty princess, loved by everyone, and kind unlike some lovers of luxury. The man looked closely at the young princess with a smirk on his face. Sometime later, he came to the cherished meeting. Opening the door, he saw a gorgeous young lady standing in front of him. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he could come in. The man blossomed before our eyes as he saw his lovely muse, Angelica. He bowed to her with a joyful smile and said that unfortunately they had not seen each other for a long time. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he had met Princess Stella. She wondered if he had given her the invitation. Jean said with a happy smile that everything went great, and he even managed to introduce himself. Angelica looked at the man with a smile. He froze in shock as he knew that every glance of the young lady brought him inspiration. Jean knew he needed to add to his collection as soon as possible. The lady looked at Jean intently and with a gentle smile said that she envied him for how he had managed to meet the princess. She sighed heavily because she wanted to see her too. She smiled and said that thanks to the princess's fund, her losses were significantly reduced. Speaking about the princess, she said with a gentle smile that she was her savior. The man smiled and said that the princess was very noble and smart, which is what attracted attention to her. The lady smiled and said that it was all true and that it was very good news, but she was also excited, wondering if she could become her friend. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she would really like to be friends with the princess. She hesitated and looked away from him because she knew that she did not have the courage to do so. She knew that many men wanted to profit from marrying her, and all the people who had become her eyes and ears were already boring her. She sighed heavily, as she knew that they were only interested in her money, but unfortunately, she couldn't throw them out. She looked at the man intently and said that the princess was very noble, and she thought that the princess could become a good friend. He smiled and said that was exactly it. The lady thought for a moment about everything that was happening. A moment later, she said with a smile that she could probably meet her in high society. Young Daisy sat on the ground and drew pictures of herself and her sister. The men quietly approached the girl and watched her closely. The man looked at the girl with a grin. She, in turn, quietly whispered that she missed her sister very much. A moment later, an axe flew towards the men with a roar, and they were taken aback in a way they had not expected. But they were dealt with like lightning, and a moment later the men lay on the ground. The man looked at them intently and asked his friend who it was. The man asked his friend if he had killed them, wiping his apron. The man said that it was just ketchup on him and that they were alive. He sighed heavily and said that he heard them by accident because they were talking very loudly about the palace and the kidnapping. They looked intently at the young girl, who sat quietly and called for her sister. The man told them that they had to go get a carrier pigeon and send a letter to the princess because she had to know about the attack. Jason sat in his office, sipping tea and looking at the newspapers. He sighed heavily as he saw that the newspaper contained stories exclusively about the princess. He knew perfectly well that there was a good reason why all the inhabitants admired the princess, a small and barely noticeable distant star burning for everyone. She was the only one who heard the voices of people and stars. She was like a compass that led the empire in the right direction. She was the guide of the sun and the moon, the creator of the stars. Everyone wanted her return when hard times came to the empire, and she heard the prayers of the people, and in doing so, she illuminated the sky with light. She was the heir to the star that had regained its power. After 20 long years, the true revival of imperial power came with Stella. He sighed heavily and put aside all the newspaper clippings, as he wanted to meet the princess as soon as possible. With the speed of lightning, he got ready and went, but when he opened the door, he froze in place because he saw the princess in front of him. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand why she had come to him. The princess looked at him with cold fury and furiously directed her hand towards his face. Young man, you in turn managed to catch her hand. Thus she did not hit him in the face, but he froze in surprise because he did not understand what was happening. The princess took her hand back with the speed of lightning. She looked at the young man with cold fury and asked how he dared tell the emperor about her family. Jason froze in shock. He realized that she had most likely heard the rumors. He knew that if that was the case, he would actually get a slap in the face. She looked at the young man with cold fury as she expected an answer from him. A moment later, his expression changed, and he asked with a smile if she would like some tea. Jason smiled and informed the princess that she didn't like the tea he offered last time, so he ordered all new varieties from the estate. He smiled tenderly at the princess and asked if she would like to try. The young princess looked at him with fury and anger, while he smiled tenderly at her. A moment later, they were sitting at the table, and he was pouring tea. She was furious because she realized that even in such a situation, he continued to pretend to be the very picture of nobility. He looked closely at the princess and said that he was still interested in why she thought it was he who had passed the information on to the emperor. She looked at him intently, but did not answer, as she did not understand why he was not speaking formally to the princess. She thought that he was behaving very impudently. Ethel, looking at Jason, said that at first she suspected her sister, but it turned out not to be her. Jason slowly pushed a cup of tea towards the princess and said that it wasn't him, because she knew that he and the princess were very close friends. He looked at her intently and said he was very sorry. He asked if she really treated him worse than the princess. Ethel, barely containing her anger, said that he didn't need to change the subject at all. He looked at her intently and said that the princess was too cunning. Ethel, looking at the Viscount, said that the princess was not so stupid as to do something like that. Ethel told the young man that she knew perfectly well that his henchman had been at a meeting with the Empress. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she really already had her own people in the palace. Ethel looked at him angrily and informed him that the Empress had sent the prince to find out where her family lived, and Jason had pretended not to know anything. She looked at him intently and asked why he would do that. He looked at the princess intently and, with an innocent smile, said that it was just a simple misunderstanding. She looked intently at the young man but said nothing. But a moment later, the young princess's expression changed, and she looked at him with a grin and said that she couldn't stand it when someone didn't get it the first time. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she could trust him, at least when it came to money. She said that he kept her family's address a secret, and she remained his special client. The princess sighed heavily and said that was their deal. She looked at him intently and said with irritation in her voice that he had broken her trust. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked what was the reason for such behavior. She wanted to know if it was because of business. He looked at her closely, knowing that she was wrong. He wondered if she was now treating him simply as a businessman. He looked at the princess intently and said that if he was just a businessman to her, then there was no point in their deal. He said that he simply could not do it on purpose because he knew that he would lose her trust. With lightning speed, he stood up and told the princess that next time she should send a letter before coming to him. He sighed heavily and said that today he would pretend that their conversation had not happened. He looked sideways at the princess with a hint of malice in his eyes and said that she was his special client and he valued his time very much, especially his own. She looked intently at the young man but said nothing. A moment later, he said that it was time for him to leave. A moment later, the princess quoted him as saying that he had sworn by his diamond mines. He turned around and looked at her. With fury, the princess asked, with a smirk, if he was really upset that she had taken away his property. For a moment there was dead silence between them. The young man looked at the Duke intently and said that if the princess found out that he was following her, she would not like it. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he knew about it very well. He remembered how she had received the carrier pigeon. He was puzzled, as it was the first time he had seen her so sad and worried. He sighed heavily and said he just wanted to make sure the princess was safe. Jason looked at the princess intently and asked again what she wanted to bet. The princess said she would like to bet that it was he who revealed her family's address. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she wanted if she won. She looked at him intently and said that if he lost, he would be obliged to kneel before her. The young man was taken aback because he did not expect to hear such a thing. He trembled and asked how she would prove that it was he who did it. The young princess slowly rose and walked towards his table. She froze near the table and stared at the newspaper clippings. The princess took the newspaper in her hands and, walking slowly around the room, said that she had spent the night yesterday at the Duke's mansion. Ethel said that she thought it was quick, but if he had missed such a headline, she looked at the newspaper with irritation. The princess said that this full-page article was just nonsense because there were many witnesses to her arrival at the Duke's house. Ethel noted that now he was selling his information quite expensively. She looked at him intently and said that not a single article about her had appeared. She looked at the young man intently and said that someone had interfered with this. She looked at him with fury and asked who this man was who held the entire press of the empire in his hands, and at the same time had himself once suffered from rumors. She looked at him intently and informed him that with this news, he had shut down the rumors about her and the Duke, and now he had irrefutable evidence before him. The princess said that she guessed everything when she saw the article. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really needed her that much. For businessman Jason Evandors, the princess would be the ultimate reward. Despite the size of the stake, the diamond mine still belonged to the investor. But before reaching this result, the man deprived him of any possible benefit. Make him the groom of the princess. She looked at him intently and said that this incident was a test and a warning because he respected her authority. The princess looked at him intently and asked what profit she would bring him already. She said that she knew his desire and possibilities. She wondered if it was necessary to test him in this way. She looked intently at the young man who sat silently. A moment later, the princess broke the silence and said that if he understood her, he should kneel down. She said that she knew perfectly well that it was he who had revealed her family's address to the emperor. A moment later, the young man, having lost all his pride, approached the princess and knelt down. With lightning speed, he took her hand and kissed it. His expression changed, and he looked at the princess with a smile. The princess sighed heavily and looked away from him. She said that he looked very pleased. Ethel asked if this kind of thing was his hobby. Jason said with a beaming smile that he would not kneel before anyone, but he respected her so much that he was ready to do even that. With lightning speed, she pushed his hand away and said that it was very funny of him. He smiled and said that he admired her determination very much. Jason said with a beaming smile that it was no wonder that she was the one raising the Evandors' importance. He said that he wanted to be close to her. She looked at the young man intently and asked with a grin if she should be happy now. He smiled and said that she didn't need to be angry at all. He also said that there was a whole article about the necklace, and he decided to show it to his father and family members. He said with a playful smile that they would judge him if he gave the money to anyone. The princess looked at him intently but did not answer. He looked at the princess with a smile and said that she herself had previously said that she would leave this place in 6 months. He said that he would be very sorry if she left while she was with the Duke's wife. The young princess froze in place, in surprise. She did not know how he knew that she was leaving. She understood that his ability to obtain information simply terrified her. He looked closely at the young princess and asked if she would like to be the head of an empire instead of just leaving. The young princess froze in shock because she did not expect to hear something like that. He looked at the princess with a satisfied smile and said that she could easily take the place of the emperor. Jason came closer to the princess and, holding out his hand, said that he would certainly help her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if the emperor's place would really be hers. He said with a satisfied smile that gold equal to the cost of the mines, is it enough to make a beautiful picture with its image? He smiled and said that the family would be touched and he would become her perfect right hand. Jason said with a smirk that being the Empress's assistant was a great honor for him, and it would also be significant for her. He looked at the princess intently and said that if she followed his plan, and if she allowed him to help her, then he would become her devoted colleague. The princess couldn't help but laugh in his face. The young man's beef with a grin. She said that it sounded very tempting. With lightning speed, she pushed him away from her and said that she didn't know how to evaluate his family. Ethel looked at the young man with a smirk and said that before she risked her money, she must first be sure of its value. She looked at him intently and asked why the owner had removed the dog that had bitten him. The young man froze in shock, as he had not expected to hear anything like that. But the princess, in turn, looked at him intently with a satisfied grin on her face. After a long conversation with the princess, he was left alone. Looking sideways at his advisor, he said that he would like to help the princess become empress. The man looked at his master intently and said that he would naturally support him in any decision, but he was surprised and did not understand what was the reason for such a decision. Jason said that the current emperor was under the influence of his family, and it was not surprising because it was about money. The man looked at the gentleman intently and said that everything was exactly like that, and he personally believed that if a wise and calculating princess were put in this place, their family would be at a loss. Jason sighed heavily and said that everything was correct in turn. He was even glad that the princess was not interested in power. The man looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked how he came to this conclusion. He sighed heavily and said that he knew what else he could do, as he really wanted to get the princess. The assistant froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from the master. Jason sighed heavily and said that his desire to own the princess was much greater than her need for his business. The man looked at the gentleman intently and said that he must act. Jason looked at the assistant in surprise. The man smiled and told the gentleman that this was in the spirit of the Evanders. A moment later, the young man sighed heavily. He thought that his last name would suit the young princess very well. The young lady slowly left the young viscount's place. She suddenly froze as she saw someone's silhouette. She turned around with lightning speed, but saw no one. Clyde looked closely at Ethel as she walked out of Jason's estate. Clyde noticed that she was okay. A moment later, he told his knights that they could leave. The man looked at the princess in surprise and asked if something had happened. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. Sitting in the carriage, she sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had made a mistake. She thought for a moment because she knew it couldn't be him. She understood perfectly well that the Duke would be very surprised that she ran away so abruptly and did not even thank him for the night's lodging. The princess was furious because she understood that the Viscount was to blame for everything, but she also understood that she was to blame herself because she was too careless, because she put her parents and sister at risk. Sometime later, she was walking down the corridor of the palace when suddenly Karen ran out and called her. Ethel ignored her sister and continued to go about her business. The princess screamed and called her again. A moment later, she ran up to her sister and, grabbing her hand, said that she must go away with her so that they could talk. With lightning speed, they moved into the room. Karen looked at her sister intently and informed her that she had done nothing. She said that it was very hard to believe, but she wanted sister to listen to her carefully. Looking at the princess, she said that Jason had sent the editor to the Empress. Ethel took her hand from her sister and said that she understood everything. Karen looked at her sister with concern and asked her angrily why she should tell her anything about her family. She was furious and asked if she looked like a fool. Ethel looked at the princess intently and asked why she was so scared. The young princess was surprised, looked at her sister, and asked what she was talking about. Ethel looked at her sister intently and said that she would soon enter social circles and celebrate her return. She came closer to her sister and asked if she was afraid that on that day she would reveal her true nature to everyone. Karen was beside herself with rage. She did not understand how sister could say such a thing. Ethel looked at her sister with cold fury and said that she should continue to be afraid until she revealed her true nature to everyone. Ethel told her sister she didn't know what it was like to lose something important. She said she should continue to be afraid. Karen was furious. She screamed that her sister was wrong, said that if everyone found out about the deal, she would be the one who would be disappointed. She said that everyone knew that Princess Stella was an amazing and incredibly beautiful girl. But if the contract came to light, then everyone would understand that she was simply abandoned, and for this reason, she stupidly disgraced the royal family. Ethel stood her sister's words with dignity. She looked at her sister intently and asked what if she disappointed them. Karen asked her sister with anger in her voice what she was talking about. She screamed about her sister with fury in her voice that she would lose absolutely everything. Ethel came closer to her sister and asked with a grin, why then of the two of them? Only she was risking less losses, constantly rushing about in fear. Karen shouted furiously at her sister that since she was making an enemy out of her, then she would become one. She looked at her sister intently and said that she had better stop trusting just anyone, especially the Viscount. She screamed at her sister that she should be grateful that she was even telling her that. Ethel sighed heavily and told her sister that she knew all this perfectly well without her. Karen looked at her with a smirk and said that she did not know this. The man shouted furiously at the Viscount. He did not understand how he could win for the 10th time in a row. He shouted that this was pure fraud on the part of the Viscount. Jason Gambling thought for a moment. Since he got everything he wanted and did whatever his heart desired, he knew that this was a common thing for him. He looked at the man with a grin and asked if this was a scam. The man backed away and froze in place. He could not utter a word. A moment later, the man shouted angrily at the Viscount that he was playing with people as he pleased. The young man sighed heavily. He knew that this was exactly how it was, because if he wanted something, he would just take it. He remembered how the young princess had returned the necklace to him. She had written in a letter that they needed to make some changes, and also asked if she would disgrace him if she came in person. He wondered what would happen if he won her affections. Late in the evening in the garden, the young princess turned to the stars as she wanted to hear news about her family. The star told her that her sister was learning to count. Daisy was very good at addition, but she had difficulty with subtraction. Ethel listened to the news about her sister with a joyful smile. The star said that her father was repairing the fence and the workers were very quick. For this reason, the repair would not take long. The young princess understood that this happened because of the hired killers from the palace. She was very angry about this. She sighed heavily as she wanted to make sure for herself that everything was okay between them. Moments later, the star informed the princess that the child of the sun was coming towards her. The princess looked back as if she realized that her brother was approaching her. She was surprised because she didn't expect to see him at all. The prince looked at his sister intently and said that he would like to explain himself. 10 years ago, when the young princess still lived in the palace, she was playing with her brother with a joyful smile. The prince smiled and said that he was leading, and she should quickly hide. She looked at her brother intently because she knew that he was like a hero from a fairy tale. He was affectionate, fair, and wonderful. She looked at him with admiration because she was glad that she could spend time with him. She knew he was kind to everyone. He smiled and shouted that they would be peeping. She hid with a joyful smile and waited for him to look for her. At that time, no one paid attention to her except him. But unfortunately, the young prince never came to look for her. She sat on the damp ground and shivered from the cold. Some time later, she decided to come to the palace. She froze at the door when she saw her brother, who was happily talking with others. A moment later, the prince turned and looked intently at his sister. She froze and looked at him as their eyes met. But a moment later, he simply looked away from her. She froze in place, but did not approach him. The next day, he asked his sister for forgiveness, as he was very busy in the evening. The young prince looked at his sister with a radiant smile and asked if she forgave him. She knew that he was her most delightful brother. Taking a flower from him, she said with a radiant smile that of course she forgives him. She understood perfectly well that his love was her salvation. The prince looked at his sister with a gentle smile and said that the squad sent by their mother must have greatly alarmed the guests. He said that he thought she would come to him first for an explanation, but he decided to come to her himself. He began to speak, but the princess interrupted him and said that he should not continue the conversation, and it would be better for him to return to where he came from. The prince looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such coldness. He looked at her closely and with a gentle smile said that of course he understood that it was not easy for her. He said that if she knew the reason, she would understand what he was talking about, why their mother sent a military detachment. The young princess sighed heavily and looked away from him. After a short pause, she asked if he thought she would feel better if he apologized to her. She looked at her brother intently and said that he didn't even need to try because not everything in this life can be fixed. The young man backed away because he didn't expect to hear something like that. He sighed heavily and said that she was much more perceptive than he thought. He said that he understood perfectly well that those people were very dear to her. She smiled and asked how he knew about it. She asked if he had learned about it from his father, who told him about the letter she had written, or from his mother, who had spread the information about the Evandors and the foster parent killer. She looked at him with a smirk and said that it seemed like he learned everything from his mother because it was he who needed information about the Evandors. The prince froze in place from shock. He came closer to the princess and shouted that this detachment was sent only to gather everyone in the palace. He shouted that their father told their mother not to interfere in her affairs, but she simply could not stay away. The princess calmly said that she thought she just wanted to get rid of the mistake. The prince was furious. He did not understand how she could boldly say such words. He shouted that the empress was her mother. The young princess pushed her brother away and said that the empress had abandoned her. The prince shouted that the empress was very sorry for what happened many years ago, and this was the pure truth. The young princess shouted angrily that she didn't care about it. She shouted in anger and asked what kind of regret was making her life so difficult. She looked at her brother with fury and asked how long she could use it. The prince was taken aback. He did not expect to hear such a thing from her trembling. He asked if she really was his sister. She sighed heavily and said that he was the most wonderful brother. He smiled and said that it was all true. The prince said with a smile that she should take a closer look because he was her brother. She sighed heavily with anger. Looking at her brother, said that for someone uninvolved, he was too desperate in his justifications. The prince was shocked. He did not understand what she was saying. She looked at him with cold fury and said that it was not only her mother who abandoned her. That day, the prince froze in shock for a moment. She knew perfectly well that her brother was a cruel witness. She looked at him with cold fury and calmly said that many years ago, he also abandoned her. She knew perfectly well that during all this time he had become as cold-blooded and callous as all the members of her family. She looked at him intently and said that he had abandoned his sweet and obedient sister, after which she was gone. Ethel clearly knew that their love was now worthless to her. She looked at him intently and with a smirk said that he could keep his regrets to himself. The prince was shocked by her words. The next day, the maids were slowly getting the young princess ready. The maid came closer to the princess and said that she had received a letter. Ethel was surprised when she saw a letter from Jean. The maids whispered among themselves because they saw that the princess was not in the mood and were worried that she would not want to open the letter. A moment later, the maid informed the young princess that she had a visitor. The young lady was surprised that someone had come to see her this morning. She thought for a moment and remembered the Duke, because she knew that day she didn't even say anything before leaving. She realized that the Duke was most likely very worried and decided to visit her himself. But she froze in surprise when she saw the young Viscount in front of her. The Viscount looked at the young princess with a smile and said that she did not need to worry at all, as he had only come to personally discuss her request. She slowly opened the newspaper and read that the article was about how she refused to accept the necklace he gave her, and for this reason, the declaration of love was not mutual. He smiled and said that he saw the article and immediately rushed to her. She sighed heavily and said that it was very sweet. Jason looked at the princess with a beaming smile and said that he wanted to see everything for himself. As she left, she smiled and said that it was very good. The princess sighed heavily and said that if that was all, then he could go. A moment later, the young man grabbed the princess by the hand, and for a moment the princess froze in place. After a few seconds, Princess Soya looked at him with fury and said that he should remove his hands immediately. The young man was taken aback and said with a smile that he had not thought and asked for forgiveness. He looked at the princess intently and said that she should remember that if last time he obeyed her because of money, now it was because of sincere sympathy. The young lady froze in place in surprise because she did not expect to hear anything like that. The young princess looked away from him and said that perhaps that was the case, but she also asked if there was a clause in their contract about involving her in scandals. He looked closely at the princess and said with a sly smile that nothing was said about a ban either. She looked at him intently and said that she could have Pope dispelled the corrections from other media outlets because she knew that he was not the only one capable of doing such a thing. He smiled and said that Daily Velvet controlled all media. A moment later, the princess pushed the young man away from her. He looked at her intently and said with a beaming smile that he meant no harm. Jason took the princess by the hand and said with a smile that she knew that he was very positively disposed towards her, and he considered that something to be proud of. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that since he had spoiled her mood, she could use his favor for any purpose. She was furious because he had done something unforgivable, and now he just wanted to make amends. Ethel looked at him with a smirk and said that it was his style. He froze for a moment in surprise. Some time later, the young princess was walking along the corridor of the palace. She knew that when she met her mother, she would unleash her indignation on her because she had treated her beloved prince so rudely. The young princess sighed heavily. She knew that she had no place in the palace, but unfortunately, she also knew that she could not go to her home or to the hotel. She sighed heavily because she did not know where to go. Some time later, she visited the stable. She looked at the horse with a smile, as she rarely came, but it always recognized her. A moment later, she heard a voice, and with the speed of lightning, she turned around, for the young man said that horses should not do that. She was frightened and did not know who had come for her. A moment later, she clearly saw the silhouette of the Duke in front of her. The Duke came closer to the young princess and froze in surprise, as he did not expect to see her at all. He came closer to her and asked what she was doing here. He was alarmed because he saw that she was crying. The Duke slowly touched her face. He was very angry because he did not know who dared to offend her. The young princess looked away from him and asked him to pretend she wasn't there. He sighed heavily and said that he was trying to do that. But a moment later, with the speed of lightning, he took her into his arms. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if something had happened. The Duke smiled and asked if something had happened. She sighed heavily and said that they would now pretend that they knew nothing and that nothing had happened. The Duke sighed heavily because he wanted to ask her a question right now. He wanted to know what kind of relationship she had with the Viscount. He wanted to know what she really thought about Jason. He wanted to know if she thought about him at all. He really wanted to know how she really felt about him. The young princess sighed heavily and told the Duke that she was going to suffocate. The Duke was taken aback and moved away from the princess. He stood there, embarrassed, looking at the princess. The Duke sighed heavily because he knew that her beautiful smile was much more important right now. Ethel looked at the young man intently and said that she wanted to go somewhere. After a short pause, she asked if he could accompany her. The Duke touched her hair with his tenderness and with a soft smile said that he would follow her wherever she wished. The princess froze for a moment in embarrassment because she did not expect to hear such a thing. Some time later, they came to her family. She watched them closely from afar. The young lady looked at her family with a smile because she wanted there to always be such a view. She sighed heavily and said that in this place she felt alive for the first time. She remembered how her aunt told her the history of the hotel, that this building was built by her great-grandmother. She told how dear it was to her. Ethel sighed heavily because she knew that this hotel was 3 times older than her. Ethel looked into the distance. She knew that she was now part of the family. Ethel looked at the Duke sharply and informed him that they should go back. Clyde looked at Ethel sharply and asked if they should meet her family. Ethel sighed heavily and said that she did not at all wish to repay their good nature with disasters. Ethel knew that if her presence caused bad rumors to affect them, she would have to tell them that she was now in danger and that they must pack their things and leave their home. Ethel didn't want them to regret taking her in. In the past, Ethel genuinely wanted their life to be the same as it was before she arrived. She knew that would be enough for her. Clyde looked at Ethel and said that it was wrong for them. Ethel looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke looked at the princess intently and said that when a beloved child to whom parents are willing to pass on a family heirloom encounters trouble, everyone else suffers too. He smiled tenderly and said that running away would not solve the problem at all. The young lady froze in place in surprise, as she was not prepared to hear such things. He smiled and said that he was sure that if we were talking about the princess, he knew she would do everything to protect them. For a while the princess stared at her fiancé, not taking her eyes off him. A moment later they heard a noise in the distance and looked down intently. The young princess was alarmed as she saw her sister surrounded by young boys. At the same time, the prince sat in his room and thought in bewilderment about what he had done. He tormented himself for hurting a child who needed his love. He was worried and did not know how he could now regain her trust. The prince looked at the small box that lay in front of him with a smile. He knew that his sister's coronation was coming soon. He wondered if she wanted to go with him. At the same time, the little boys pounced on the poor girl. They shouted that her sister had run away. They mocked her, saying that her family had sold. Her sister Daisy screamed furiously that it was not true. They mocked, saying that they were now living on this money. With tears in her eyes, the young girl screamed that it was all a lie. She said that her sister left because she was a princess. A moment later, the young boys burst into wild laughter at her words, mocking her and saying that she was now speaking complete nonsense. The young man smirked and told Daisy that since her sister was a princess, she should be more vigilant. They mockingly asked if the princess who had recently returned to the palace was really her sister. They said that her sister had either died or been sold into slavery and was now serving her master. The young princess was furious. She wanted to go to her sister and protect her, but the Duke grabbed her hand and said that her sister should sort this out herself. The boys spoke with disdain that things seemed to be going very badly at their inn, and they said that she should ask her lying mother if she had really sold her own daughter. A moment later, the Duke walked up to the young boys and called out to Daisy. Everyone froze in shock. Daisy looked at the knight in surprise, as he was shining with beauty. With lightning speed, the Duke covered his knee before the young lady, and with a radiant smile, said that the princess had sent him. He looked at the young lady intently and said that her sister had to return to the palace urgently, and he had something to tell her from the princess. He glanced sideways at everyone present and said that no matter how far away she was, she constantly missed her home and family. The young guys were shocked, as they did not expect to hear anything like this. Daisy, with an admiring smile, asked if this was true. She asked if her sister really looked like that very princess who wears luxurious clothes and drinks tea in a mannered manner. The Duke said with a smile that everything was exactly so, and she was the most noble and beautiful princess in the world. The young lady was surprised, and at the same time very happy for her sister. A moment later, the Duke handed the young lady some coins, and a small beautiful bow from the Princess. Daisy was very happy with such a gift. She looked intently at all the boys who had bullied her before and shouted that her sister really was a princess. A moment later, she looked at the Duke and asked if he could tell her sister that they loved and missed her very much. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he would certainly convey everything to the princess. At the same time, the princess stood quietly behind the tree and listened to them. She could barely hold back her tears. The Duke looked sideways at everyone present and said that he was warning them, as the representative of the princess, that if this happened again, he would deal with them in an appropriate manner. The young boys looked at the Duke in fear. He looked at them with a furious look and said that he would definitely teach them a lesson in good manners that they would remember for the rest of their lives. A moment later, the young boys left their molars with the speed of lightning and forgiveness. The young lady looked at the knight with admiration, as he was her savior. Some time later, the young people were walking around the city. The Duke looked at the princess in surprise and asked if something was wrong. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. She just wanted to check something. A moment later, they leisurely entered the shop where they sold newspapers. Ethel looked closely at the newspaper and asked the man if this was the only news about the princess. The man sighed heavily, as he had been asked this question more than once during the day. He said that it was true. Ethel noticed that the newspaper had little detail about the Princess. Ethel also noticed that the picture was blurry. The man asked the girl irritably what she was trying to find. He couldn't know the details. So when did you find anything in the high society magazines? She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really talking about the Daily Velvet. She asked if there wasn't her picture in it. He was annoyed and said he thought so. He also said that if they weren't going to buy the paper, they should leave. A moment later, the young princess sighed heavily and informed the Duke that it was time for them to go, and with lightning speed, they turned around and walked towards the exit. The man was taken aback and shouted after them, but the Duke looked at him with a cold gaze and he fell silent. Some time later, they were returning to the palace. In a carriage, the young lady asked the Duke for forgiveness for keeping him. He smiled tenderly at her and said that there was nothing wrong with it, and he had enjoyed spending time with her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as his words surprised her. He touched her face tenderly, as he noticed that it had turned very red. The young lady pulled away from her fiancé, embarrassed, and thanked him for the day and for passing on her words to her sister. She smiled and said that it was kind of him. A moment later, she took his hand and pulled him towards her. The Duke froze for a moment with bewilderment on his face. A few seconds later, the young princess tenderly kissed the Duke on my cheek. The Duke froze in place from embarrassment. Ethel thanked the Duke with an embarrassed smile, calling him by name.